Welcome back. You're watching True Scary Stories. Before we start, I need you to do one thing. Turn off the lights, because tonight's story isn't just scary, it's real. This is a true scary story. In this new story, a frozen campsite in the Appalachians was found abandoned. 919 was carved into a tree. The winter wind howled through the skeletal trees of the Appalachian Mountains as the search party reached the high ridge. They had been looking for a missing man for 3 days before they finally stumbled upon his remote wilderness campsite. Leland Vance was a 42-year-old forestry consultant who had disappeared during a sudden and violent January blizzard. The campsite was strangely intact, with his tent still standing and his expensive gear laid out as if for dinner. The only thing that was out of place was a series of numbers carved deeply into a nearby pine tree. Search leader Elias Graves noted that the campsite looked like it had been abandoned in a very great hurry today. The stove was still sitting on a flat stone-and-a-half eaten meal was frozen solid in a bowl. There were no footprints leading away from the site because the heavy snow had filled in every single track already. One of the volunteers pointed toward a large white pine tree that stood on the edge of the small clearing. Deeply carved into the frozen bark were the 3 numbers 919 in a very clean and precise hand. Leland Vance was a seasoned professional who spent most of his adult life mapping the remote corners of the wilderness. He was hired by a private land trust to survey a rugged section of the forest that had been untouched. The man was known for his meticulous planning, and he never entered the woods without a secondary and tertiary plan. His wife reported that he had been excited about the project because it involved several thousand acres of ancient forest. Leland drove his rugged truck to the end of a logging road and set out on foot with his pack. He carried enough food for 5 days and a high-frequency radio to keep in touch with the base camp. The weather forecast had been clear when he started his trek toward the high ridges of the deep mountain range. He reached the survey site by late afternoon and set up his tent before the light began to fade away. The forestry consultant recorded a brief radio check-in to confirm that he had arrived safely at his first waypoint. By the second night, a massive cold front moved across the valley and dropped the temperature to 10 below zero. The radio at the base camp crackled to life at exactly 9:19 in the evening with a frantic call. Dispatchers heard Leland whispering that something was moving outside his tent, and he sounded completely terrified for his own life. He repeated his coordinates twice, but his voice was drowned out by a loud screeching sound of metal on wood. The transmission cut out abruptly, and the search team was organized within the hour to begin the long uphill trek. They fought through 2 feet of fresh snow and biting winds that threatened to freeze their exposed skin in minutes. The team reached the survey coordinates and found the small clearing where Leland had pitched his green nylon tent. It was standing perfectly straight, and the stakes were still hammered firmly into the frozen and rocky mountain soil. There was no sign of a struggle or any animal tracks in the immediate vicinity of the abandoned campsite. Elias Graves opened the tent flap and found the sleeping bag of the missing man was still warm to touch. It appeared that Leland had stepped out of the shelter only moments before the rescuers arrived at the quiet site. His boots were still sitting by the entrance, and his heavy winter coat was draped over a plastic storage bin. The rescuers were confused because no sane person would step out into a blizzard without their boots or a coat. They fanned out in a circle and began to scan the tree line with their high-powered search and rescue flashlights. That was when they discovered the fresh carving on the pine tree that displayed the numbers 919 today. The wood was still pale where the knife had cut through the bark, and the sap was barely even frozen. Elias checked the GPS location and noticed that they were standing exactly at the 919-foot elevation. This was a strange coincidence, but the search leader felt that the numbers held a much more significant meaning then. The search team spent the next 6 hours combing the ravine, but they found nothing but frozen rocks and ice. They returned to the campsite to pack up the belongings of the missing man for further forensic and legal study. A small notebook was found tucked inside the pocket of the surveyor vest that Leland had left in his tent. The last entry was written in a shaking hand and mentioned a low hum coming from the earth beneath him. Leland wrote that the sound reminded him of a heavy machine or a very large and rhythmic breathing of animal. He noted that the numbers 919 were appearing on the screen of his digital radio every few minutes. The consultant seemed to be losing his grip on reality as he described seeing shadows walking through the white snow. He claimed that the shadows were wearing old-fashioned logging clothes and carrying heavy iron tools from the past century. This final entry was dated only minutes before the last radio transmission was received at the dispatch center today. Regional historian Silas Burke was called to the station to examine the strange carvings and the notes from the journal. He spent hours digging through the county archives and found a folder containing records from the year 1919 today. A massive logging accident had occurred on that exact ridge exactly 105 years before the current disappearance. 9 men had been trapped inside a collapsed mine shaft during a blizzard that lasted for nearly 2 full weeks. The historical records indicated that only 1 man was ever recovered alive from the deep and dark frozen mountain earth. The survivor had been found wandering near a campsite, and he was repeating the numbers 919 over and over. Silas showed the rescuers a photograph of the logging crew and pointed to a man standing in the very back. The man looked remarkably like Leland Vance, and he was holding a carving knife that featured a very unique handle. The historian explained that the logging crew had been working for a company that went bankrupt shortly after the accident. The investigation took a turn when the forensic team analyzed the radio that Leland had left behind in his tent. They discovered that the device was tuned to a frequency that did not officially exist on any modern radio charts. The frequency was exactly 91.9 megahertz, and it was broadcasting a loop of old mountain folk music. This music had been popular in the early 1900s and featured the sounds of a fiddle and a banjo. The technicians were baffled because there was no transmitter within 50 miles that could be sending such a clear signal. They followed the signal strength, and it led them to a hidden cave entrance located behind a thick, frozen waterfall. The ice was nearly 3 feet thick, and the rescuers had to use chainsaws to cut through the white wall. Behind the ice was a narrow tunnel that smelled of old wood smoke and the scent of pipe tobacco. They moved deeper into the dark cavern while the radio signal became louder and clearer in their handheld receivers. Inside the cave, they found a small room that had been furnished with a wooden table and a single chair. A kerosene lamp was burning on the table, and it cast a long, flickering shadow against the damp stone walls. Leland Vance was sitting in the chair with his eyes closed and his hands resting flat on the table surface. He did not respond when the rescuers called his name, and his skin felt as cold as the ice. There was a carving on the table that matched the numbers 919 found on the tree at camp. The man was holding a small piece of paper that appeared to be a map from 1919 today. It showed the location of the 9 loggers who had been buried in the mine shaft over a century ago. Leland began to whisper the names of the men in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone. He claimed that he had to stay in the room to keep the lamp burning for the lost souls. The rescuers carried Leland out of the cave and back to the base camp, where a medical helicopter was waiting. He was treated for severe hypothermia, but the doctors were amazed that he had survived the extreme cold for long. The surveyor had no memory of how he reached the cave or why he had left his gear behind then. He told the investigators that he felt like he was being pulled by a very strong and invisible thread. The man claimed that the numbers 919 were a code to unlock a door that he found. He refused to speak about what he saw behind the door, and he became very quiet after the incident ended. The forestry consultant resigned from his job and moved his family away from the mountain region only a month later. The carvings on the tree were later removed by the Park Service to prevent any other hikers from being lured. People in the valley still whisper about the day the mountain tried to reclaim a life from the current year. A follow-up investigation by the state police found that the cave entrance had vanished behind a new rock slide. They could not find any trace of the tunnel or the room where the kerosene lamp had been burning brightly. The radio frequency 91.9 returned to static, and the mysterious music was never heard on the air. Technicians from the university suggested that the solar flares had caused a temporary rift in the local magnetic field. This explanation did not account for the warm sleeping bag or the physical carving on the frozen pine tree bark. The case was officially closed as a mountain accident with no evidence of foul play or any criminal intent. Leland Vance never returned to the Appalachians, and he refused to even look at a map of the area. He told his wife that some places are not meant to be surveyed by the eyes of living men. The mountain remains silent, and the snow continues to fall over the ruins of the old logging camp bridges. The mystery of the numbers 919 remains a topic of conversation for the hikers who visit the trail. Some believe it was a warning from the past, while others think it was a plea for a rescue. The records of the logging accident are now kept in a secure vault at the County Historical Society office. Visitors can see the photograph of the crew, but the man in the back is now strangely faded away. The image seems to be disappearing from the paper as the years go by since the surveyor went missing. It serves as a reminder that the mountains have a way of balancing the books when it comes to time. We are only temporary visitors in a landscape that has been here for millions of years of shifting ice. The camp at the high ridge is now overgrown with new growth, and the pine tree has finally died. The numbers 919 are gone, but the memory of the call still lingers in the cold wind. The forest has a way of hiding its most dangerous secrets beneath a layer of white snow and dark shadows. We listen for the radio signals, but often find only the silence of the trees and the heavy mountain air. Leland Vance is safe in the valley, but his spirit seems to have stayed behind in that dark stone room. He often wakes up in the middle of the night and whispers the numbers to the empty and quiet air. His family watches him with concern, but they know that some experiences can never be fully explained by science. The Appalachian Range continues to stand as a wall between the past and the present for those who listen. Every winter, the snow falls and the mountain waits for the next person to step off the marked trail. We must remember to keep our lamps burning and to never follow the shadows into the deep frozen woods. The story of the campsite is a warning to all who think they can master the wild and old. Some carvings are meant to stay hidden in the bark of the trees and the memory of the earth. In this new story, an Appalachian hiker's final audio recording repeats one number, 919. The deep ridges of the Appalachian mountain range are home to thousands of miles of dense forest and hidden limestone caverns. Many people enter these woods every year to seek adventure, but some of them never return to the civilized world. Harlan Gable was a 39-year-old wildlife biologist who specialized in the study of apex predators and their behavior. He was currently working on a project to track the movement of black bears during the colder and leaner winter months. The biologist spent most of his time alone in the wilderness with only his telemetry gear and a heavy pack. He had set up a base camp in a remote valley that was known for its rugged terrain and steep cliffs. The weather was turning cold as a front moved in from the north and brought the threat of freezing rain today. Harlan was checking his traps when he noticed a flash of metallic silver reflecting from a small and shallow forest creek. He stepped through the thick brush and found a professional-grade audio recorder that was partially submerged in the cold water. The device was encased in a protective weather housing, but it was covered in a thick layer of gray mountain mud. Harlan carefully wiped the screen and pressed the power button to see if the internal batteries still held a small charge. The screen flickered to life and showed that there was only one audio file stored on the large memory card inside. He plugged his headphones into the jack and listened to the recording, which lasted for exactly 9 minutes and 19 seconds. The sound was mostly the rushing of wind through the trees and the distant call of a solitary and lonely bird. Then he heard a man's voice whispering the numbers 919 over and over with a tone of extreme fear. The man sounded like he was hiding from something, and he was trying to keep his voice as quiet as possible. Harlan felt a chill run down his spine as he listened to the frantic and repetitive chanting of the mysterious hiker. The biologist decided to stop his bear research for the day and return to his camp to report the strange find. He used his satellite phone to call the local ranger station and spoke with a woman named Brenda Thorne who worked there. Brenda was the head dispatcher for the regional search and rescue team, and she had a reputation for being very thorough. She listened to Harlan's description of the recorder and asked him to stay at his camp until a team arrived. The dispatcher mentioned that a hiker named Bennett Ward had been reported missing in that exact area only 4 days ago. Bennett was a 31-year-old sound engineer who had traveled to the mountains to record the sounds of nature. His family had not heard from him since he set out on a solo trek toward the high and rocky ridges. The search party reached Harlan's camp by late evening, and they were led by a veteran woodsman named Elias Graves. Elias was a man who had spent over 40 years exploring every hidden corner and dark cave of the Appalachian Range. He took the audio recorder from Harlan and listened to the file while the other searchers set up their gear. The veteran ranger noted that the background noise in the recording contained a very strange and rhythmic thumping sound like metal. He suggested that the sound was coming from an old ventilation fan used in the deep and abandoned coal mines nearby. These mines had been closed for over 60 years, but many of the shafts were still open and very dangerous today. Elias believed that Bennett Ward might have fallen into one of the vertical shafts while he was exploring the ridge. The numbers 919 were still a mystery, but the ranger felt they might be a specific location or code. He checked his topographic maps and looked for any landmarks that might correspond to the 3 numbers found on the device. The search team began their investigation at the creek where Harlan had found the silver recorder in the thick mountain mud. They found a set of boot prints that were leading away from the water and toward a steep and rocky incline. The tracks were spaced far apart, which indicated that the man had been running in a state of great and sudden panic. They followed the prints for 2 miles until the trail ended abruptly at the entrance of a hidden and dark cave. This cave was not marked on any of the official maps used by the Forest Service or the local hiking clubs. Elias shone his powerful flashlight into the opening and saw a piece of equipment lying on the cold stone floor inside. It was a high-quality microphone mounted on a tripod, and it was pointed toward the back of the deep cavern. The team moved cautiously into the cave while the temperature dropped and the air became thick with the scent of ozone. Inside the cave, they found more evidence that Bennett Ward had been present and was working on a very large project. There were several notebooks filled with technical drawings of sound waves and notes about a frequency that he called the phantom pulse. Bennett wrote that he had discovered a natural resonance in the mountain that occurred only during a specific and rare alignment. He claimed that the sound was so low that it could not be heard by the human ear, but animals felt it. The notebooks mentioned that the frequency was exactly 9.19 hertz, and it caused a feeling of intense dread. Harlan Gable realized that the bears he was tracking had been avoiding this specific ridge for the last several weeks. The animals were sensitive to the infrasound, and it was driving them away from their traditional winter dens and sleeping areas. The biologist felt the same low vibration in his own chest as they moved deeper into the dark and quiet. The searchers found a small room at the back of the cave that had been used as a temporary camp. Bennett's backpack was sitting in the corner, and his sleeping bag was spread out on a flat and smooth stone. There was no sign of the sound engineer, but the walls of the room were covered in more hand carvings. The numbers 919 were etched into the limestone in a frantic and disorganized pattern that covered every single wall. Elias found another recording device sitting on the stone table, and he pressed the play button to hear the final entry. This recording was much shorter, and it contained the sound of a heavy door being slammed shut and a loud scream. Then there was silence for several seconds before Bennett's voice came back on the line with a final and desperate message. He said that he had found the source of the 919, and it was not a natural sound. The man claimed that the mountain was acting as a giant speaker for something that was trapped deep within the earth. He whispered that the sound was actually a countdown, and it was reaching the final stage of its long and dark. The search team felt a sudden tremor in the ground, and the low hum became a deafening roar that shook stone. They scrambled to exit the cave as rocks began to fall from the ceiling and the air filled with dust. Elias and Harlan made it out just as the entrance collapsed under the weight of a massive and sudden rock slide. They stood in the cold mountain air and watched as the entire ridge seemed to settle into a new and permanent. The radio beacon that Harlan had heard earlier was now gone, and the silence of the woods returned to normal. They searched the debris for any sign of Bennett Ward, but they found nothing but broken stone and gray mountain mud. The investigation into the disappearance of the sound engineer continued for several months, but no body was ever recovered from site. The Forest Service officially closed the area to hikers and researchers due to the instability of the rocky and steep terrain. Harlan Gable returned to his bear study, but he could never shake the feeling that something was still watching him. He often thought about the recording and the terrified voice of a man who had heard the voice of Mountain. The biologist decided to analyze the audio files using a specialized computer program at the local university laboratory and office. He discovered that the numbers 919 were not just a frequency, but a set of geographical and map coordinates. When he plotted the numbers on a grid, they formed a perfect circle around the ridge where the cave once stood. The center of the circle was a location that did not exist on any known map of the Appalachian Range. Local legend spoke of a hidden valley that appeared only once every 100 years, when the moon was in position. The old-timers in the town of Pine Creek claimed that the mountain had a heart that beat in rhythm. Harlan realized that Bennett Ward had found the entrance to this place, and he had been pulled inside by force. The numbers were a warning to anyone who was listening to stay away from the high ridge and the cave. The story of the final audio recording became a cautionary tale for the hikers who visited the remote and wild area. We are reminded that the earth has its own language, and sometimes we are not meant to understand the words. The final recording of Bennett Ward is kept in a secure vault, and it is never played for the general public. People say that if you listen closely to the wind on a cold night, you can still hear the voice. The mountain remains a place of deep mystery, where the past and the present often collide in the most strange ways. We must respect the boundaries of the wilderness and the secrets that are buried beneath the stone and the trees. Harlan Gable eventually moved away from the Appalachians and took a job at a coastal research station in the South. He never spoke about the 919 again, but he always kept a small piece of limestone in his desk. The stone was a reminder of the day he heard the heartbeat of the mountain and the voice of a man. We are all just visitors in a world that is much older and more complex than we can ever know. The silence of the forest is not always empty, but it is often filled with the echoes of the lost. The story of the hiker is a testament to the power of the unknown and the strength of the earth. The state police report on the incident mentioned that several other hikers had reported hearing a strange hum in the woods. None of them had found the cave or the recordings, but they all felt a sense of unease and dread. The case of Bennett Ward remains one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in the history of the Forest Service. His family still holds a vigil every year on the anniversary of his disappearance near the trailhead of the mountain. They hope that one day the mountain will give back what it has taken and reveal the truth of his fate. Until then, the ridge remains a silent monument to a man who listened too closely to the voice of the earth. The wind continues to blow through the trees, and the snow covers the ruins of the old and deep caves. We are left with only the numbers and the memory of a voice that whispered in the dark and cold. The mystery of the numbers 919 continues to haunt the people who live in the shadow of the peaks. Some say it was a message from another dimension, while others believe it was a glitch in the natural world. Whatever the truth may be, the legacy of the final recording will always be a part of the mountain lore. We look at the peaks and wonder what other secrets are waiting to be discovered by the curious and brave. The Appalachian Range is a vast and ancient landscape that has seen many things come and go in its time. We are just a small part of a much larger story that is being written by the earth itself every day. The silence is a gift that we should cherish, but we must also be aware of the sounds below. The story of the hiker is a reminder to always carry a light and to never wander too far away. Harlan worked with a sound technician named Silas Vance, who specialized in acoustic forensics to clean the audio file for study. Silas spent weeks cleaning the audio file to remove the wind noise and the sound of the rushing creek water today. He discovered that the voice in the recording was not just repeating the numbers, but was also singing a soft melody. The tune was an old mountain ballad that had been forgotten by most of the people living in the valley floor. The lyrics spoke of a man who was trapped in a world of stone and was waiting for the light. Silas found that the melody had a mathematical structure that matched the frequency of the 9.19 Hz signal. This discovery led them to believe that the mountain was not just a physical object, but a living and breathing entity. They presented their findings to the board of the Historical Society, but they were met with skepticism and many doubts. The researchers were told that their theories were too speculative and lacked the necessary scientific evidence to be taken as truth. Harlan was undeterred and continued to study the relationship between the sound and the behavior of the local wildlife in winter. He found that the birds in the area had changed their flight patterns to avoid the sonic shadow of the ridge. The biologist documented these changes in a series of detailed reports that he submitted to the National Park Service scientists. He hoped that his work would lead to a better understanding of the acoustic environment of the Appalachian mountain range today. The final audio recording of Bennett Ward was eventually digitized and added to a national archive of unidentified sounds and voices. It remains a subject of study for scientists and paranormal researchers who are interested in the mysteries of the deep woods. The mountain continues to stand as a silent witness to the events of that cold and dark winter day long ago. We are left with more questions than answers, but the mystery of the 919 will always linger in minds. The forest is a place where the logic of the world often breaks down and gives way to the unknown secrets. We must be prepared for the things that we cannot explain and the voices that we cannot always hear or understand. The hiker's final recording is a bridge to a world that we are only beginning to understand in the modern age. We listen to the static and wait for the next message to arrive from the deep and the dark places. The Appalachian Mountains are waiting for the next person who is brave enough to listen to the silent and old voice. The story of Bennett Ward is a reminder that we are never truly alone in the wilderness of the world today. We are part of a larger mystery that is being told by the rocks and the trees and the wind blowing. In this new story, a 919 emergency ping came from a section of trail closed for decades. Park rangers working the rugged corridors of the Pacific Northwest often share stories about ghost frequencies that haunt the airwaves. These electronic anomalies usually occur during the heavy winter months when the atmosphere is thick with ice and static interference. 38-year-old technician Bramwell Thorne spent his career maintaining the microwave relay towers that keep mountain communications alive. He was assigned to investigate a persistent emergency ping coming from a sector known as the Devil's Throat. This particular trail had been permanently closed to the public since a series of unexplained geological shifts in 1980. Bramwell packed his heavy thermal gear and a specialized signal tracer before heading into the frost-covered timberline that morning. He expected to find a faulty transmitter or perhaps a weather balloon that had crashed into the restricted valley floor. The snow was piled 5 feet deep, and every step required the full strength of his legs against the wind. He reached the high ridge overlooking the closed sector and turned on his portable radio to calibrate the tracer unit. The speaker emitted a rhythmic pulsing sound that repeated the numbers 919 in a flat and digital voice. He checked his topographic map because no official equipment had been registered in that specific valley for over 40 years. The signal was remarkably clear and lacked the typical distortion you would expect from a device buried under heavy snow. Bramwell felt a strange vibration in his chest that seemed to sync with the steady repetition of the haunting numbers. He adjusted his snowshoes and began the steep descent into the valley where the trees grew in twisted and unnatural shapes. The air in the Devil's Throat was significantly colder, and the light of the sun seemed to struggle to reach. He found a rusted metal gate that had been pushed inward by a force much greater than a simple snowdrift. The trail beyond the gate was overgrown with thorny brush that had been bleached white by the extreme mountain cold. Bramwell noticed a series of orange flags tied to the branches that looked like they had been placed very recently. He followed the markers until he reached a small concrete bunker that was not listed on any of his maps. The heavy iron door was slightly ajar and a thick bundle of black cables snaked out into the white snow. He stepped inside the dark structure and turned on his flashlight to reveal a room filled with vintage recording equipment. Reel-to-reel tapes were spinning slowly on their spindles despite there being no visible power source in the room. A logbook lay open on a wooden desk with the name of a missing ranger named Silas Thorne written. Bramwell realized with a shock that this man was his own uncle, who had disappeared in 1982. He began to read the handwritten entries, which described a phenomenon the Rangers called the 919 emergency resonance. Silas wrote that the mountain was acting like a giant battery that stored the last sounds of people who were lost. The notes claimed that the signal was not a call for help, but a loop of energy trapped in stone. Bramwell found a series of photographs tucked into the back of the logbook that showed a strange, glowing blue light. This light appeared to be hovering just above the ground near the exact spot where the emergency ping originated today. He felt a sudden wave of nausea as the radio in his pocket began to scream with a high pitch. The voice on the frequency changed from a digital tone to the unmistakable sound of his uncle calling for help. He ran out of the bunker and followed the sound toward a deep crevice that was hidden by the shadows. The signal led him to a sheer wall of granite where the numbers 919 were carved into the rock. He looked down and saw a hand reaching out from a narrow gap in the freezing and solid mountain stone. Bramwell reached out to grab it, but his fingers passed through the air like he was touching a cold mist. The hand vanished, and the radio signal went completely silent as a massive shelf of snow shifted high above him. He scrambled back toward the ridge, just as an avalanche buried the bunker and the trail under tons of ice. He reached his truck and sat in the silence for a long time while the heater struggled to warm his hands. Investigations into the bunker later revealed that no such structure had ever been built in that remote, enclosed sector. The frequency of 9.19 MHz is now officially banned for use by any ranger or rescue team. Bramwell eventually resigned from his position and moved to the coast where the mountains could no longer watch his every move. He still hears the rhythmic pulsing in his dreams whenever the winter wind begins to rattle the windows of his home. The files regarding his Uncle Silas remain classified by the Forest Service as an unsolved case of a tragic mountain accident. Rangers still warn new recruits to never investigate a signal that comes from a trail that has been officially closed. They say the mountain does not like to be reminded of the things it has taken from the world above. Safety is found in staying on the path and ignoring the voices that call out from the deep and cold. The 919 ping is a reminder that some emergencies never truly end, even after the snow has finally melted. Keep your radio off when the sun goes down and the shadows start to stretch across the lonely white peaks. Silence is the only answer the mountain will give you if you go looking for the secrets of the past. Bramwell Thorne knows that his uncle is still out there, part of the signal that never stops repeating in the dark. Don't follow the ping because the trail leads to a place where time and space no longer have any meaning. Stay in the light and remember that the most dangerous signals are the ones that sound like a familiar voice. The records from that winter show that several other technicians reported hearing the same digital voice during the peak of storms. These men were all veterans of the high country who knew the difference between equipment failure and something truly out of place. One report from 1994 mentioned a similar bunker appearing and disappearing near the edge of the Devil's Throat. It seems the mountain itself creates these spaces to lure in those who are curious enough to wander off the path. Bramwell often wonders if the hand he saw was trying to pull him in or warn him to stay far away. He never spoke to the investigators about the photographs he found because he knew they would never believe his strange story. The logbook he left behind in the bunker is now buried under 60 feet of packed ice and broken timber. No one will ever read the final warnings Silas Thorne wrote during his last nights alone in that frozen concrete room. The official stance of the Park Service is that Bramwell suffered from high-altitude sickness and mild hallucinations that day. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence and the historical closure of the sector as proof of his confused state. Bramwell did not argue with them because he knew the mountain had cleaned up any trace of its hidden basement. He spent the rest of his life avoiding high elevations and any device that used a high-frequency radio band. His family never found closure regarding Silas, but they stopped asking questions when Bramwell returned with a look of pure, "Some things are better left buried under the winter snow where the sun cannot reach the cold and the dark." The legend of the 919 signal persists in the break rooms of ranger stations throughout the entire mountain range. New recruits laugh about it until they spend their first night alone on a ridge during a heavy winter whiteout. They find themselves checking their radios and turning down the volume when the static begins to sound like a human. It is a lesson learned the hard way by those who think the wilderness is a place that can be. If you ever find yourself in the Cascades during a blizzard, keep your eyes on the markers that are official. Ignore the orange flags that seem to lead toward the cliffs and the areas that the maps say are closed. The mountain is an ancient entity that remembers every name of the people who have stepped off the beaten trail. It uses the technology we bring into its territory to create traps that are perfectly suited for our modern ears. Bramwell Thorne is just one of many who felt the pull of the 919 and barely escaped. He knows the mountain is still waiting for the next signal technician to hear the call and follow the coast. The silence of the coast is his only comfort now that he knows what lies beneath the granite, and he will never go back to the high country, and he will never follow a signal into the white. The 919 is still there, pulsing in the cold air, waiting for someone to answer its hollow. Stay safe and stay on the trail because the mountain is always listening for a voice it can. This is the truth of why rangers say to never follow a signal in the winter, regardless of. The mountains are beautiful, but they are not our friends when the temperature drops and the world turns. This archived recording exposed a fatal mistake. The steep limestone cliffs above the northern shoreline remained untouched for decades until a heavy storm uncovered a buried secrets. Records from 1974 describe a geological survey that went missing during a sudden and violent spring thaw event. Elias Vance was a 52-year-old field technician who had spent 20 years mapping the shifting coastal ranges. He was a practical man who understood the language of the earth and the way the rocks moved in the models. On a Tuesday in early April, Elias arrived at the remote base camp to finish his final set of readings. The wind was already picking up speed as he carried his heavy recording equipment down toward the deep canyon floor. He noticed a strange warmth coming from the center of the ravine, which defied the freezing air of the mountain. Elias knelt down to examine the granite slabs and found a hidden copper wire tucked into a corner of the. He pulled the wire with all his strength and watched as a small section of the earth shifted to the. A narrow staircase made of packed dirt led even further down into the darkness beneath the original floor of the. Elias felt a sense of duty to ensure the data was accurate, so he climbed down with a dim electric. The air down there was thick with the scent of old parchment and something sweet like honey or very ripe. He reached the bottom and found himself in a circular room lined with shelves made of polished black volcanic river. Hundreds of small metal canisters were arranged in perfect rows, and each one was sealed with a thick layer of. Elias picked up a canister and felt a rhythmic vibration that pulsed against his calloused palms like a tiny heart. He heard a faint sound that resembled a distant choir singing a melody he had not heard since his early. The storm outside intensified and buried the canyon entrance under a massive drift of heavy and wet mountain snow. For local dispatch logs from that week indicate that the base camp manager reported Elias missing after his truck was found. Search parties could not reach the building until the following Monday, when the winds finally died down and the sun. They found the canyon door wide open, but the main storage area was completely empty and silent in the winter. A deputy noticed the shifted floor slab and followed the dirt steps down into the hidden chamber beneath the canyon. He found Elias sitting on the floor, surrounded by dozens of broken metal canisters that were leaking a strange blue. The technician was staring at the ceiling and whispering a list of names that had been forgotten by the local. His tools were scattered across the dirt floor, and his lantern had run out of power many hours before they. Witness statements from the rescue team mentioned that the blue mist seemed to move against the wind like it was. The air in the hidden room was reportedly so hot that the men began to sweat despite the freezing outdoor. Elias refused to leave the circle of broken jars and claimed he was finally listening to the voices of the D. He told the deputy that the canisters held the final frequency of every person who had died in the valley. The archives of the Geological Survey did not contain any mention of a secondary basement or a collection of canisters. Investigators found a leather-bound ledger on one of the black stone shelves that contained detailed entries from 1840. The handwriting matched a previous surveyor who had been removed from the project for practicing forbidden and strange acoustic rituals. Each entry described a process of capturing a person's final resonance inside a vessel to preserve their spirit for. The local doctor examined Elias and found that his hearing had become supernaturally sensitive to the point of causing him. He could hear conversations happening in the town square miles away and describe the sound of the grass growing under. The authorities were unable to explain how the metal canisters had remained hidden and active for over 100 years. They decided to remove Elias from the room by force because he was showing signs of extreme mental and physical. As they carried him up the dirt stairs, the blue mist followed them like a shadow until they reached the priest watched as the mist dissipated into the cold winter air and the sound of the singing, finally. Elias never returned to his work as a field technician and spent his remaining years living in total and absolute. He claimed that the world was too loud now that he had heard the true voice of the mountain. The survey board met in secret during the first week of May to discuss the future of the remote. They decided that the risk of the hidden chamber was too great for the staff to handle during the winter. A crew of workers was hired from a different county to ensure that the details of the room remained private. They poured 10 tons of industrial concrete into the hidden staircase until the room was completely filled from floor to... The workers then sealed the metal wire under a new layer of reinforced limestone and bolted the canyon door shut. No one was allowed to enter the lower level of the ravine for any reason for the next 40 years. The official reason given to the public was that the area had become dangerously unstable due to the heavy spring. However, the people who lived nearby reported hearing a faint humming sound coming from the ground during every major coastal. A final report from a structural engineer in 1995 noted that the concrete had developed strange and glowing. He suggested that the material was reacting to a thermal source deep underground that should not exist in that zone. The site was eventually decommissioned and the land was sold to a private trust that keeps the property strictly. Some believe the canisters were not just holding sounds, but were acting as a seal for something much older and... The voicemail Elias Thorne left for his sister on the night he disappeared is still kept in a secure police. He sounded happy on the recording and told her that he was finally learning how to truly listen to the canyon remains a tomb of concrete and secrets that the town has agreed to leave alone in the time. It is a quiet reminder that some parts of history are better left buried deep beneath the heavy mountain. The archived recording revealed a fatal mistake made by the original surveyors who first entered the deep and dark mountain. They had inadvertently tapped into a natural resonance that the human mind was never meant to hear or to fully... The tape captured the sound of the earth opening up and the voices of 1,000 years calling out in. Elias had not found a treasure, but had stumbled into a biological trap that was designed to consume the curious. The recording ends with the sound of a heavy door closing and the final words of a man who, he realized too late that the jars were not empty, but were waiting for a fresh soul to fill the... The tragedy of the Vance family became a cautionary tale for every new technician who was assigned to the Northern. They were told to never dig too deep and to always listen for the humming that precedes a major event. Today, the canyon is a restricted zone, and the Forest Service keeps a constant watch over the site of the tomb. The concrete has held for now, but the heat continues to rise from the depths of the Black Volcanic River. People in the town still talk about the man who could hear the grass grow and who knew the Ben. They wonder if he is still out there in the silence of his room, listening to the voices of... The archived recording is a silent witness to the power of the earth and the mistakes of the brave. We are left with the cold facts and the mystery of the canisters that still pulse in the dark. The story of Elias Thorne is a part of the mountain now and forevermore in the deep, and the journey into the white is a path that leads to a place where time has no more meaning. The final page of the ledger was translated in 2005, and it contained a warning for the next. It stated that the earth has a memory, and it does not like to be disturbed by the noise of. Those who seek the truth must be prepared to pay the price with their own silence and their own. Elias paid that price, and he found the peace that he had been looking for since he was a. We can only hope that the concrete holds and that the jars remain buried in the dark of the pos. The archived recording exposed a fatal mistake that can never be undone by the hands of any living human. The mountain remains a giant in the clouds, and it keeps the names of the lost and the found. The story ends here, in the quiet of the office, where the records are kept and the lights. The silence of the northern range is a heavy thing that stays with you long after you leave the woods. Most people do not spend enough time in the trees to understand the way the light changes on the. Silas was a man who knew every trail and every stream, but he did not know the mountains heavy. He was a part of the forest, and in the end, the forest decided to keep him for its. The church basement and the seismic bunker and the maintenance shed are all connected by the same dark heavy. They are places where the rules of the world seem to thin out and let the other side lean. The story of the technician who ignored the warning is a story of a man who found home. It is a quiet reminder that the world is much bigger than we are, and it has its. We keep the files and we tell the story, but we do not pretend to know the true final. The ice has its own language, and it speaks to those who are willing to listen in the. The cabin site is now a peaceful clearing where the grass grows tall and the birds sing in. There is no sign of the struggle or the frost or the figures that stood in the living. But the air is still a bit colder there than it is in the rest of the mountain. Hikers report that their watches stop and their compasses spin when they stand on the spot where the cabin. They feel a sense of peace and a desire to sit down and rest for a long time. The story of the archived recording is a part of the mountain now, and it will always stay. We are moving toward the end of the records, and the final page is a simple drawing of the dog. It shows a door standing open to a forest filled with silver lights and people made of mountain. What Elias discovered after forcing the frozen door was a man who had found his way back to the day. He was not a victim of the storm, but a host for a gathering that defied the winter. The mystery remains, but the facts are clear and the evidence is stored in the local police station. We will remember the name of Elias Vance and the night the blue mist came inside to stay. The wind is picking up again, and the snow is starting to fall on the high peaks of day. It is time to close the file and leave the mountain to its own devices and its own. The story is finished and the narrator is tired and the lights are starting to fade out now. Good night to the valley and to the ridge and to the people who are still waiting in the. The cold truth remains buried beneath the ice and the stone and the memory of the man who heard. We are just the listeners to an echo of a life that was taken by the wind and snow. The voicemail is the only proof that he was ever happy in the place where he finally found Dare. The warning was real and the cost was his life, but he seems to have found a final. We will keep the records safe, and we will remember the name of the man who walked into. The forest is waiting for the next winter to clear so it can show us something new and. The story of Elias Thorne is a part of the mountain now and forevermore in the deep. This archived recording exposed a fatal mistake that changed the history of the entire Northern Valley for everyone. The truth is often colder than the winter wind and harder to face than the freezing and salt. In this new story, the 919 call wasn't on any network, but dispatch heard it clearly. Official communication logs from the High Sierra regions often contain entries regarding signals that bypass modern digital encryption protocols. These events typically occur during the deepest winter months, when the atmosphere is thick with ice crystals and electromagnetic static. 27-year-old telecommunications specialist Soren Vance worked as a systems analyst for the Regional Emergency Response Center. His job involved monitoring the relay towers that maintained a vital connection between isolated mountain outposts and the main. In early February of 2022, he noticed a persistent alert flashing on his monitoring station during the graveyard. The notification system indicated a Priority 1 emergency broadcast originated from a sector that had no active towers or equipment. Soren checked the digital diagnostic panel several times, but the incoming signal remained steady and showed zero packet loss. The source location was identified as a remote ridge known as Ghost Pass, where no infrastructure had existed since. He put on his headset and adjusted the volume to hear the raw audio feed coming from the silent sector. A faint, rhythmic pulsing sound began to leak through the encrypted channel, usually reserved for federal law enforcement search teams. Soren used his specialized signal tracer to isolate the noise, but the frequency shifted every few seconds with perfect. It was a synthesized digital voice that repeated the numbers 919 over and over in a flat tone. He checked the active deployment map because there were no authorized teams working in that specific area on that night. The voice did not sound like any dispatcher or field agent he had ever encountered during his 3 years. He continued to monitor the transmission while the repeating signal began to feel like a physical pressure inside his head. Soren decided to record the audio and cross-reference it with the historical archives stored in the secure facility. He reached the digital storage vault and began searching for any mention of the 919 emergency resonance frequency. The data indicated that a similar signal had been recorded during a massive blizzard in 1974 near Ghost. Records from that era described a technician named Silas Thorne who had disappeared while investigating a mysterious radio interference. Silas had been sent to the pass to repair a damaged copper line that connected a remote fire lookout. The archive notes mentioned that the radio signal started as a faint whisper before it eventually became loud enough to... Soren looked at the last transcript, which simply stated that the technician was going to follow the signal to its. He felt a sudden chill as he realized the signal he was hearing today was identical to the recording. He contacted the lead dispatcher to report the anomaly and the strange historical connection he had uncovered in the... The dispatcher responded with static at first, but then the 919 signal cut through the transmission with clarity. Soren was ordered to remain at his station while a field unit was sent to investigate the mountain ridge. He watched the real-time tracking data as the emergency vehicle moved toward the trailhead leading up to Ghost. The headlights of the truck were visible on the remote camera feed until the thick fog swallowed the entire. He stepped away from his desk to grab a cup of coffee, but a loud sound stopped him in his. The radio in the break room began to play the same pulsing tone that he had been monitoring for. He realized the signal was no longer coming from the mountain, but was now broadcasting from inside the facility itself. The synthesized voice began to change and started to say his name between the repetitions of the numbers 9. He followed the sound toward the server room and found that every cooling fan in the racks had stopped. The temperature in the room had dropped to nearly freezing despite the heavy insulation and the lack of external. He opened the main diagnostic terminal and saw a series of symbols scrolling across the screen in bright green. The numbers 919 were etched into the digital interface so deeply that the pixels began to burn. Soren reached out to touch the screen, but a massive static discharge knocked him backward onto the cold concrete. He looked up and saw a figure standing in the shadows of the server racks wearing a vintage parka. The person was holding a handheld radio that was emitting a steady blue glow in the middle of the file. He recognized the man from the file photo of Silas Thorne, who had been missing for over 40 years. The investigation into the facility-wide power failure began the following morning when the sunrise finally hit the mountain. Search teams found the emergency vehicle abandoned at the trailhead with the engine still running and the doors wide open. They discovered a portable radio belonging to the field unit that was transmitting on the 9.19. The device was found sitting on top of a stone marker that was not listed on any official trail. There were no signs of a struggle and no footprints in the fresh snow to suggest where the officer, a park supervisor named Miller, found a series of handwritten notes stuffed into the glove box of the truck. The handwriting matched the notes left by Silas Thorne in 1974 with terrifying accuracy and level of torn. Soren Vance was found inside the server room in a state of deep shock and suffering from extreme hypothermia. He told investigators about the figure he saw in the shadows and the blue light that came from the ton. Forensic experts examined the server logs and found that a signal had originated from deep inside the solid granite. This frequency was measured at exactly 9.19 megahertz, which is a band not utilized by any. Park staff now maintain a constant watch on that specific frequency during the winter months to prevent further loss. They tell newcomers that the mountain has a way of recording the past and playing it back during the D. Most people think it is just a technical glitch caused by the high altitude and the intense winter static. Soren never returned to his job at the communications center and moved to a city far from the set. He still keeps a small battery-powered radio in his house, but he never turns it on during winter. The mystery of the signal remains a quiet warning for those who work the high and lonely mountain relays. Silence is usually the safest thing you can hear when you are monitoring the vast and empty winter wilderness. Following a signal into the dark is how many careers end before the sun has a chance to rise. The mountains do not have a voice of their own, so they must borrow one from the people there. Safety is found in the networks that are mapped and the signals that we can actually verify and understand. Dispatchers say to ignore the 919 because the source is never something that wants to be truly. Stay on the grid and keep your radio tuned to the channels that the living people still use. Winter has a way of making the world feel small and the mysteries of the air feel dangerous. Every year, the snow covers the evidence of those who decided to follow the signal into the high pass. If you hear that pulsing sound in your headset, you should turn it off and walk away from. Nothing good ever comes from a signal that asks you to leave the safety of the known, and the mountain is a beautiful place, but it does not care if you find your way back to. Listen to the wind and the trees, but do not listen to the numbers that repeat in the twilight. Silence is a gift when the temperature drops and the world becomes a place of shadows and cold. Soren knows the truth of the warning because he felt the pull of the mountain on that final. He survived because he chose to close his eyes and ignore the haunting sounds coming through his small headset. Many others were not as lucky, and their names are now part of the long list of the missing. Keep your gear ready and your mind sharp when the winter wind begins to howl through the ancient. The signal is still out there, waiting for the next person to listen long enough to feel the. Don't follow the 919 because the destination is a place where the sun never quite seems. Stay safe and stay grounded when the high peaks call out with voices that do not belong to. The forest is deep, and the secrets are older than the names we have given to the stone. Keep the light on and the radio quiet while the winter holds the world in its cold. This is why the dispatchers tell you to never follow a signal that you cannot find on a. The final report on the incident at Ghost Pass was heavily redacted by the regional authorities before being filed. They claimed that a natural gas pocket had caused the hallucinations and the strange behavior of the electronics involved. Soren did not believe the official explanation because he still felt the cold in his bones whenever it snowed. He spent his time researching the history of the ridge and found dozens of similar cases dating back centuries. Each disappearance was preceded by a report of a repeating signal or a rhythmic sound coming from the local. The local tribes had names for the mountain that translated to the place where the voices are kept. He realized that the technology we use to communicate is just another tool for the mountain to use. The 919 signal was a lure designed to capture the curiosity of those who listened to. He often wondered if Silas Thorne was still wandering the server rooms of the world looking for a connection. The blue light he saw that night was not a part of any electrical system he had ever. It was a manifestation of the energy that the mountain had stored over thousands of years of human. He began to write his own logbook to document the things the authorities tried to hide from the Auntin. He warned that the digital age had only made it easier for the mountain to find its next. The frequency of the human heart is reportedly close to the resonance of the granite found in the process. This similarity allows the mountain to broadcast directly into the minds of the people who are sensitive to. Soren kept his notes hidden in a secure box that he buried in his backyard near the Steins. He hoped that someone would find them before they also heard the pulsing sound of the nine. The record shows that the signal appeared again in 2024 during a record-breaking ice storm in. This time, a group of 3 researchers disappeared while tracking the movement of a glacier near Ghost Pass. Their last transmission was a series of numbers that matched the 919 frequency with perfect digital. The search teams found no trace of their equipment or their bodies, despite a massive effort lasting 3. The Park Service has since placed a permanent ban on any electronic devices within 5 miles of the claim. They claim it is to protect the delicate ecosystem, but the rangers know the real reason for the pros. They have seen the blue lights flickering on the ridge when the moon is full and the blue after. They have heard the voices of their former colleagues calling out from the static of their hand radios. Silence is the only defense against an enemy that uses your own voice and your own technology. The mountain is patient, and it will wait for the next generation of technicians to forget the old. It will wait for the next winter when the air is still and the signals can travel. Soren Vance lived the rest of his life in the desert where the ground was sand, and he never looked at a mountain again without feeling the weight of the 919 in. He knew that some calls should never be answered regardless of how clearly they are heard by. The truth is buried under the ice and the static and the redacted files of the National. Stay away from the sector known as Ghost Pass and keep your radio tuned to the truth. This is the story of the call that was not on any network but was heard. In this news story, a hiker's 919 call came from deep in the Appalachian snow. The emergency dispatch center in a quiet mountain county received a call that defied every law of modern physics. It was a Tuesday evening in January when the first heavy blizzard of the season slammed into the steep ridges. Dispatch logs recorded a man claiming he was trapped inside a stone cellar while the freezing wind howled in the background. 34-year-old land surveyor Garrett Vance set out that morning to mark property lines near the forest boundary. He was a seasoned outdoorsman who grew up navigating the dense thickets and steep ridges of the southern Appalachian Range. Garrett told his wife he would be back by 5 because a massive cold front was moving in from the west. He carried a heavy pack with thermal gear and a satellite phone, since cell service was non-existent in the deep hollows. The morning air was crisp and clear when he parked his truck at the end of a winding gravel road. Garrett spent several hours hammering stakes into the frozen earth while the sun hung low and pale in the winter sky. By noon, the clouds moved in quickly, and the first few flakes of snow began to dance through the dark trees. Garrett realized the storm was arriving much earlier than the local weather reports had predicted across the morning radio news. He packed his tools into his heavy bag and started the 3-mile trek back toward the safety of his vehicle. The wind picked up speed, and soon the forest was transformed into a blinding white wall of swirling ice and snow. Garrett struggled to find the orange ribbons he had tied to the low branches because the visibility dropped to near zero. He felt a sharp pinch of panic when he realized he had stepped off the main trail into an unfamiliar ravine. The surveyor checked his GPS, but the device flickered and died after the extreme cold drained the battery life in minutes. Garrett decided to find shelter under a rock overhang to wait out the worst of the whiteout conditions that afternoon. He stumbled upon a collapsed stone chimney that once belonged to a pioneer homestead hidden deep within the protected forest land. A small wooden door led down into a root cellar that seemed remarkably intact despite the weight of the heavy snow. Garrett squeezed inside the cramped space and pulled the heavy door shut to block out the biting wind and freezing air. He tried to use his satellite phone to call for help, but the signal was blocked by the thick stone walls. The man felt around in the dark and found a small shelf where a few rusted metal cans still sat undisturbed. Garrett waited for several hours while the storm roared outside and the temperature inside the cellar began to drop quite rapidly. He decided he had to make a move before the snow drifted over the entrance and trapped him underground for good. Garrett pushed against the wooden door, but it would not budge because several inches of heavy ice had already sealed it. The surveyor pulled out his emergency radio and managed to catch a faint signal from a repeater tower on the ridge. He dialed the emergency number and whispered his location into the receiver while his breath came out in thick white clouds. Dispatchers heard him describe the stone cellar and the smell of damp earth as he begged for someone to find him. The call lasted for exactly 4 minutes before the line went dead and left the operator listening to static and wind. Search and rescue teams gathered at the trailhead the following morning after the storm finally broke and the sun came out. They found the truck belonging to Garrett covered in 2 feet of fresh snow, but there were no footprints nearby today. A team of 12 volunteers spread out across the ridge and searched for any sign of the missing land surveyor that day. They tracked the signal from his last emergency call to a specific coordinate deep in a remote and wooded drainage pipe. The rescuers reached the spot and found the ruins of an old homestead, just as Garrett had described over the radio. They saw the stone chimney standing tall among the trees and located the wooden door to the underground root cellar nearby. 4 men worked together to shovel away the thick crust of ice that had formed over the heavy oak planks yesterday. They pried the door open and shone their flashlights into the dark hole to look for any sign of the man. The cellar was completely empty except for a few rusted cans and a layer of dust that had not been disturbed. There were no footprints in the dirt floor and no signs that anyone had been inside the room for decades now. The searchers were confused because the 919 call had been traced directly to this exact set of geographic coordinates last night. They checked the surrounding area for any other structures, but the homestead was the only building for several miles in directions. A local historian named Silas Thorne joined the investigation after hearing about the strange disappearance on the local evening news report. Silas spent hours digging through the county archives and found a collection of old photographs from the year 1924. One image showed a young man named Elias Vance standing in front of the very same stone cellar they had searched. Elias was a distant relative of Garrett who had vanished in a blizzard exactly 100 years before the current search began. Family records indicated that Elias had been working as a timber cruiser when a sudden winter storm trapped him in woods. The historical documents noted that Elias was never found despite an extensive search by the local community during that bitter winter. Silas showed the rescue team a journal entry from a witness who claimed to hear shouting coming from beneath the earth. The witness reported hearing a man calling for his wife from inside the root cellar long after the snow had melted. Investigators compared the recording of the emergency call to the descriptions of Elias found in the old handwritten family letters today. The voice on the tape sounded remarkably like the descriptions of a man who had been lost for a full century. Forensic technicians analyzed the signal and discovered that the call did not actually originate from a modern satellite phone or device. The frequency matched a type of radio equipment that had not been in regular use since the middle of the century. The search for Garrett Vance continued for another week until the spring thaw began to pull the snow away from hills. A group of hikers found his body resting quietly at the base of a tall cliff 5 miles from the cellar. He was wrapped in his thermal gear, and his pack was still strapped tightly to his tired and frozen shoulders then. His satellite phone was tucked away in a side pocket, and the battery was still showing a full charge of power. Investigators checked the call logs on the phone, but there was no record of any call made to the emergency center. The 919 call that the dispatchers answered had come from a source that could not be traced to any living person. The coordinates led the rescuers to a place where a man had died a century ago while waiting for a rescue. Some people believe that the mountain has a way of folding time when the wind blows hard through the frozen pines. Garrett had never made it to the cellar, but his ancestor may have finally found a way to reach out. The stone walls of the old homestead remain silent today as the forest slowly grows back over the forgotten mountain history. The emergency dispatcher who took the call was a woman named Joyce Miller, who had worked at the station for years. She told investigators that the voice on the other end of the line was filled with a strange and ancient static. The man had asked for a woman named Clara, which was the name of the wife of Elias back in 1924. Joyce felt a chill go down her spine as she listened to the recording of the call in the quiet office. She noticed that the background noise included the sound of a wood stove crackling even though the cellar had no heater. The logs showed the call was placed at the exact minute the storm reached its peak intensity over the mountain ridge. Searchers returned to the stone cellar one last time to look for any hidden compartments or tunnels beneath the old floor. They found nothing but the cold, damp earth and the heavy smell of mineral deposits that had formed over many years. One volunteer found a small iron key buried under a pile of rotted leaves near the entrance of the root cellar. The key matched a lock on an old cedar chest that had been passed down through the family of Garrett Vance. Inside the chest was a letter written by Clara Vance expressing her hope that her husband would one day return home. The letter was dated exactly 1 week after the blizzard of 1924 had devastated the small mountain community in January. Locals still talk about the night the radio waves crossed through time and brought a message from the deep mountain snow. Some say the energy of the storm was enough to open a window between the past and the present-day events. Others believe that the bond of the Vance family was so strong it could reach across a century of winter ice. The state police officially closed the case of Garrett Vance and cited accidental exposure as the cause of his tragic death. They could not explain how the emergency call was placed or why the coordinates led directly to the old homestead ruins. The audio files of the 919 call were eventually moved to a secure archive, where they remain locked away from public. A few technicians who heard the full recording claimed that a second voice can be heard whispering in the very end. The second voice sounds like a woman welcoming a traveler home after a very long and cold journey through the woods. The stone chimney still stands as a lonely monument to the secrets that the Appalachian Mountains keep hidden from the world. Hikers are warned to stay on the marked trails and to keep their radios off during the heavy winter snowstorms. The mountain does not always give back what it takes, and sometimes the past finds a way to call for help. In this new story, an Appalachian shelter was found frozen in time. Official forestry reports from the deep Appalachian Trail often contain accounts of structures that seem to exist outside of normal time. These isolated shelters are usually found by long-distance hikers who wander off the main path during the heavy winter months. 28-year-old land surveyor Jay Sterling was assigned to map a rugged section of the northern boundary last December. His primary objective for the week was to locate a historic stone shelter that had been missing from official survey maps. The weather was unusually harsh for early winter, and a thick layer of frost covered the ancient oak and hemlock trees. Jace carried a heavy pack filled with high-precision GPS equipment and thermal layers to protect him from the biting wind. He began his hike at daybreak while the sun was still a pale yellow orb hanging low in the cold sky. The trail was difficult to follow because a recent ice storm had brought down several large branches across the snowy path. He reached a high plateau by noon and noticed that his digital equipment began to behave in a very strange manner. The GPS screen flickered with a rhythmic, pulsing light that seemed to sync with the sound of the howling mountain wind. Jace checked the battery connections several times, but the device continued to display a series of random and nonsensical coordinates. He decided to continue moving forward based on his physical map because he knew the stone shelter was located nearby. The air grew significantly colder as he entered a narrow valley that felt like it was trapped in a permanent shadow. He found a small stone structure nestled against a sheer rock wall that looked remarkably well preserved for its great age. The wooden door was shut tight, and a thick layer of undisturbed ice sealed the edges of the heavy frame. He used his ice axe to clear the obstruction and stepped into a room that felt like a living tomb. The interior of the shelter was filled with gear that belonged to a much earlier era of wilderness exploration and hiking. He saw canvas rucksacks and heavy wool blankets neatly folded on the stone bunks as if someone was coming back. Jace turned on his headlamp and saw that the number 919 was carved into every single surface in sight. The numbers were etched into the wooden beams and scratched into the stone walls with a desperate and repetitive mechanical force. He found a small leather journal resting on a wooden table that was covered in a fine layer of white dust. The handwriting inside was frantic and described a phenomenon where the sun stopped moving across the cold and winter mountain sky. The writer was a geologist named Silas Vance, who had been reported missing during a survey in 1974. He wrote that the number 919 was the only thing that kept his mind grounded in reality there. Jace felt a sudden wave of vertigo as he realized that the air inside the shelter was not cold at all. He checked his thermal thermometer and saw that the temperature was exactly 72 degrees, despite the freezing world outside the door. He tried to radio his base station for instructions, but the only response was a flat and synthesized digital voice signal. The voice repeated the numbers 919 over and over in a tone that sounded like it was coming from. He stepped back toward the door, but found that the heavy wooden slab would no longer move even an inch today. The frost on the windows began to form patterns that looked like the same three numbers repeating in a crystalline loop. Jace realized that the shelter was acting like a biological battery that was storing the energy of the people trapped. He looked at his own watch and saw that the hands were spinning backward at a very high rate of speed. The investigation into the surveyor's location began 3 days later when Jace failed to check in with the regional mapping office. Search teams used thermal drones to scan the valley, but they found no heat signatures in the entire restricted mountain sector. A veteran ranger named Miller finally located the stone shelter, but found that it was completely empty of any modern gear. He discovered Jace's GPS unit sitting on the wooden table, but the screen was permanently burned with the numbers 919. Forensic experts later examined the device and found that the internal clock had recorded over 40 years of active data. This was impossible because Jace had only been missing for 72 hours, according to the official Park Service time logs. The data suggested that the device had been sitting in that room since 1974 without ever losing power. Investigators found a series of photographs on the digital memory card that showed Jace standing next to Silas Vance today. The payoff for the investigators came when they cross-referenced the numbers 919 with the local geological survey archives. They discovered that the shelter was built directly on top of a rare deposit of quartz that possessed unique electromagnetic properties. This mineral deposit created a natural resonance frequency that could potentially trap sound and light in a permanent, localized loop. The number 919 represented the specific megahertz frequency that triggered the temporal anomaly during the peak of winter storms. Witnesses from a nearby village reported seeing a blue light hovering over the valley at exactly 9:19 every single evening. The search teams eventually recovered a set of heavy wool blankets that were still warm to the touch in 19. They never found Jace Sterling or Silas Vance, despite an extensive search that lasted for nearly 6 full and exhausting weeks. The Park Service has since removed the shelter from all public maps and placed a permanent fence around the valley. Rangers now warn young surveyors to never enter an old structure that is not clearly marked on their modern digital maps. They say the mountain has a way of inviting you to stay if you listen to the repeating signals for two. Silence is the only safe thing to hear when you are standing alone in the deep and frozen Appalachian mountain woods. Following a strange number or a pulsing light is how many stories end before they even have a chance to. The stone shelter remains a hidden secret for those who know where to look among the ancient and the cold trees. Safety is found in staying on the path and ignoring the voices that call from the shadows of the past. Every year, the snow covers the tracks of those who decided to investigate the mystery of the 919. If you find a door that is frozen in time, you should turn around and walk back toward the light. Nothing good ever comes from a place that wants to keep you as a part of its own repetitive history. The mountain is a beautiful place, but it does not care if you ever find your way back to safety. Listen to the wind and the trees, but do not listen to the numbers that repeat in the dark night. Silence is a gift when the temperature drops and the world becomes a place of shadows and cold white peaks. Jace's family still receives mysterious static on their home phone every year on the anniversary of his tragic mountain disappearance. They say the static sounds like a rhythmic pulsing that matches the heartbeat of someone who is running for their life. The truth of the 919 remains buried under the ice and the stone of the high Appalachian Ridge. Stay grounded and stay on the trail that leads back to the world of the living and the warm fire. The story of the frozen shelter is a reminder that some parts of the wilderness are better left completely alone. We think we can map every inch of the world with our satellites and our high-precision digital GPS units. The mountain knows better, and it uses our own curiosity to lure us into the places where time has stopped moving. Every winter, the signal returns, and the numbers are written again by hands that no longer have a physical form. Stay safe and keep your radio quiet when the wind begins to howl through the ancient and the dark forest. The mystery is still out there waiting for the next person to find the shelter and the number 91. Don't be the one who becomes a ghost in the machine of the mountain and the cold and the dark. The Cascades and the Appalachians both hold secrets that are much older than the names we have given to them. Keep the light on and the door locked when the winter storms roll in from the north and the east. Silence is the only answer that the mountain will give you if you go looking for the truth of Silas. The legacy of the 919 is a trail of missing people and equipment that should not exist today. The forest is deep, and the secrets are kept by the stones that never forget a face or a name. This is why the rangers tell you to never follow a signal that you cannot find on a real map. Stay on the trail and keep your mind sharp when the cold begins to seep into your very tired bones. The journey ends for those who stop to count the numbers that are written on the walls of the process. Believe in the warnings and stay away from the valleys where the sun never seems to reach the ground below. This is the truth of the Appalachian shelter that was found frozen in time with the numbers written everywhere. In this new story, they followed the 919 beacon through the snow. The trail suddenly ended. The deep winter silence of the Appalachian Range is often broken by a strange radio phenomenon that locals call the 919. Search and rescue teams have documented this specific electronic frequency appearing during the heaviest blizzards of the last 40 long years. Garrison Thorne was a 44-year-old veteran of the Mountain Safety Division with over 20 years of field experience. He was responsible for coordinating emergency responses during the most dangerous months of the winter season in the high ridges. The morning of January 14th in 2024 began with a light dusting of snow across the valley floor. Garrison arrived at the remote ranger station and checked the equipment logs to ensure the mountain repeaters were functioning correctly. He planned to spend the afternoon reviewing the safety protocols for the upcoming weekend, which promised a very severe storm. The radio on his desk crackled with a sudden burst of high-frequency static that sounded like a ticking clock. He adjusted the dial and heard a faint electronic beacon repeating the numbers 919 over and over again. This signal was coming from a remote section of the forest known as the Black Rock Drainage, where nobody lived. Garrison checked the satellite map and realized there were no registered hikers or researchers in that specific and dangerous area. He contacted the dispatch center to see if any other stations were picking up the strange and persistent beacon today. The operator confirmed that the 919 signal was being broadcast from a location 3 miles off the main. Garrison decided to investigate the source of the transmission before the weather conditions turned into a full and violent blizzard. He packed his thermal gear and a handheld tracker to follow the signal into the dense and dark pine groves. The wind picked up speed as he reached the trailhead, and the sky turned a dark and heavy shade today. He followed the pulsing green light on his tracking device while the snow began to fall in thick white sheets. The signal grew stronger with every step he took toward the deep ravine that sat at the base ridge. The tracker indicated that the source of the beacon was moving slowly toward the edge of a high granite cliff. Garrison struggled through the deep drifts of snow while the cold air began to bite at his exposed red skin. He shouted into the wind, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the mountain storm as it arrived. The specialist noticed that the signal was not a modern digital pulse, but an old-fashioned analog wave from past. He checked his coordinates and realized he was standing on a path that had been closed since 1950 now. The trail had been abandoned after a series of strange disappearances that were never fully explained by the local police. He saw a set of footprints in the fresh snow that looked like they belonged to a man wearing boots. The tracks were leading directly toward the cliff edge, where the signal was strongest and most clear in his ears. Garrison felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized he was close to finding the person who was broadcasting signal. He stopped to catch his breath and pulled out a folder of historical documents that he kept in his pack. The records mentioned a radio operator named Silas Vance who had vanished in this exact spot during a blizzard once. Silas had been a fire lookout in 1924 when a massive lightning strike destroyed his high wooden tower. The archives noted that his last transmission was a distress call that featured the numbers 919 several times. Garrison compared the historical frequency to the one he was currently tracking through the white and blinding winter storm. The numbers matched perfectly, and the rhythmic ticking sound was identical to the reports from 100 years ago today. He looked at the footprints again and realized they were not sinking into the snow like normal human tracks should. They seemed to hover on the surface as if the person making them had no weight or physical body today. The searcher felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the freezing temperature of the high mountain air. The dispatch center reported that the signal had a unique modulation consistent with equipment used in the early 1920s. Garrison pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel that was covered in a heavy crust of white and frozen ice. He checked his handheld radio and tried to make contact with the mysterious broadcaster using several different emergency calling bands. No one answered his calls, but the ticking sound of the beacon became faster as he climbed up the steep. The elevation was over 3,000 feet, and the air was getting thinner with every heavy step he took then. He noticed a strange smell in the air that resembled ozone and burnt electrical wires from an old and broken. The specialist stopped near a large outcrop of granite to recalibrate his tracking gear for the final and difficult stretch. He saw a flash of light through the trees that looked like a signal mirror reflecting the pale winter sun today. Garrison moved toward the light and discovered an old wooden crate that was half buried in the cold frozen earth. Inside the crate were several glass vacuum tubes and a coil of copper wire that looked brand new and shiny. This was impossible because the crate appeared to be a relic from a time when the mountain was still wild. He took a photograph of the find and marked the location on his digital map for the search team follow. The signal strength was now pegged at maximum, and the handheld tracker was vibrating with a heavy and constant rhythm. He looked up and saw a shadow moving through the trees only 50 yards ahead of his current position. The figure was tall and wore a heavy canvas coat that looked like it belonged in a museum of history. Garrison called out again and asked the man to stop because the edge of the cliff was only a few. The shadow did not turn around, but continued to walk with a slow and steady pace toward the dangerous drop. The searcher ran as fast as he could through the waist-deep snow to reach the person before they fell. He reached the edge of the granite cliff just as the figure stepped out into the empty and white air. Garrison lunged forward to grab the coat, but his hands passed right through the fabric, as if it were. The shadow vanished into the swirling snow, and the ticking sound of the radio beacon suddenly stopped in his ears. He fell to his knees on the very edge of the abyss and looked down into the dark. He shone his powerful flashlight into the ravine and saw a collection of rusted metal beams lying at the bottom. The remains of the old fire tower were twisted like a rib cage and were partially covered by a century of... There was no sign of the man he had been following, and the fresh footprints in the snow simply stopped. Garrison looked down at the ground near his feet and saw a small brass object glinting in the pale. He picked it up and realized it was an old service key with the numbers 919 stamped. The key was warm to the touch despite sitting in the freezing snow for what should have been many years. He realized that the signal he had followed was a ghost of a man who died 100 years ago. The mountain had acted as a recording device that captured the final moments of a tragedy in the winter storm. The specialist sat on the rocks for a long time while the blizzard began to fade into a quiet. He felt a deep sense of peace, as if he had helped someone finish a journey they started long ago. Garrison carefully placed the brass key in his pocket and started the long hike back down the mountain to station. He reached the trailhead as the sun began to set over the valley and the first stars appeared in. The dispatch center asked for a report, but he simply told them that the signal had been found and silenced. He never mentioned the shadow or the tracks that hovered on the surface of the fresh and white winter. The news of the 919 beacon spread through the small town, and people began to talk about Silas. The historian confirmed that the brass key was an exact match for the lock on the old fire lookout. Silas Vance was finally given a memorial service in the local church a century after he had vanished in storm. Garrison Thorne attended the ceremony and left the brass key on the altar as a gift for the lost. The numbers 919 were never heard on the mountain again, and the radio frequencies remained silent and clear. The searcher retired from his post at the ranger station and moved to a quiet cabin in the lower. He often looks up at the high ridges during the winter and remembers the night he followed the ghost. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand as a wall between the worlds of the living and the long dead. We are reminded that some stories take 100 years to find a person who is willing to listen. The story of the 919 beacon is a reminder that we are never truly alone in. The mountain holds on to its memories, and sometimes it chooses to share them with the people who walk the path. The forensic technicians at the state laboratory were fascinated by the audio recording Garrison had captured on his digital device. They discovered that the frequency had a spectral signature that was inconsistent with any modern electrical or digital communication tool. The waves were shaped like a sine wave produced by an old spark gap transmitter from the early 1900s. This technology had been used by the Forest Service to send Morse code across long distances before the telephone lines. The technicians also noticed a faint background noise in the recording that sounded like a heavy iron door being shut. This sound matched the descriptions of the fire tower hatch that Silas Vance would have used every single day. Garrison spent several hours at the library researching the specific atmospheric conditions that were present on the night of disappearance. He discovered that a massive solar flare had occurred in 1924, just as the blizzard hit the mountain. This flare would have charged the atmosphere with an incredible amount of electromagnetic energy that could interfere with many. The specialist realized that these same conditions were present on the night he followed the signal through the deep snow. It was as if the universe had created a bridge between 2 points in time that were a century apart. He consulted with an old geologist who explained that the granite on the ridge contained high levels of quartz crystals. These crystals are known for their ability to store and release electrical energy when they are subjected to extreme pressure. The weight of the heavy snow and the force of the wind had activated the natural recording in stone. Garrison felt a sense of awe as he realized the entire mountain was a giant and ancient hard drive today. He returned to the Black Rock drainage with a team of surveyors to map the exact location of tower. They found several more artifacts buried under the layers of leaf litter and frozen soil near the base of. A leather satchel containing a logbook was recovered from a hollow log that had been protected from the moisture then. The pages were brittle, but the writing was still legible and told the story of a man who was. Silas had written that he knew he would not survive the night, but he wanted to leave a trail. He had carved the numbers 919 into the rocks as he made his way toward the cliff edge. The logbook explained that 919 was a code for the fire department in his hometown of Pine. It was his way of saying goodbye to his family and his wife, who was waiting for him home. Garrison felt a tear in his eye as he read the final words of a man who died alone. The search and rescue team voted to name the ridge after Silas to ensure his name was never forgotten. A new marker was placed at the trailhead that tells the story of the radio operator and his beacon today. Hikers often stop to leave a small stone or a flower at the base of the wooden signpost. The 919 signal is now a part of the local folklore that is passed down to children. Garrison Thorne still keeps a photograph of the brass key on his desk at home as a reminder of, he knows that the mountain is always watching and it never truly forgets the people who walk upon it. The story serves as a reminder that we should always pay attention to the small and strange things in life. Sometimes a bit of static on the radio is more than just interference from a distant and broken power source. It can be a voice from the past that is trying to tell us something important about our own history. We must be willing to follow the signal even when it leads us off the marked and safe trails. The Appalachian Mountains are a place of deep mystery and beauty that will continue to inspire us for generations. We are all just temporary travelers in a landscape that has been here since the beginning of the world. The silence of the winter woods is now a peaceful and quiet place where the ghosts can rest easy. We listen for the radio signals, but we also listen for the heartbeat of the mountain itself. The story of the 919 beacon is finally over, but the legend will live on. Garrison often wakes up in the middle of the night and thinks he can hear the ticking of the clock. He knows that the forest has a way of returning what it has taken when the time is right. The mystery of the numbers 919 remains a topic of conversation for the hikers who visit the trail today. Some believe it was a warning from the past, while others think it was a plea for a rescue. The records of the Lookout accident are now kept in a secure vault at the County Historical Society office. Visitors can see the photograph of the tower, but the man in the door is now strangely faded away. The image seems to be disappearing from the paper as the years go by since the searcher went missing. It serves as a reminder that the mountains have a way of balancing the books when it comes to time. We are only temporary visitors in a landscape that has been here for millions of years of shifting ice. The silence of the mountain is the only answer we will ever receive from the deep and dark. In this new story, every winter Appalachian hikers report the same 919 signal after dark. The cold mountain air in the southern Appalachian Range has a strange way of carrying sounds much further than normal. Local dispatchers in the small valley towns have learned to expect certain reports when the January blizzards begin to howl. Every winter, for the last 40 years, hikers have reported a mysterious radio signal that repeats the numbers 919. This transmission only appears after the sun goes down and the temperature drops below the freezing point on the high ridges. Technicians have tried to trace the source of the broadcast for decades, but the signal always vanishes before they arrive. Thatcher Reed was a 39-year-old telecommunications specialist who was hired to finally solve this long-standing mystery. He spent his career tracking ghost signals and interference for major cellular providers across the rugged eastern United States today. Thatcher arrived at the trailhead with a heavy pack filled with sensitive monitoring equipment and enough supplies for 3 days. He was a seasoned hiker who understood the dangers of the high peaks during the peak of the winter season. The specialist checked his thermal layers and adjusted the straps on his bag before stepping into the dark, frozen woods. He planned to set up a series of listening posts along the ridge where the signal was most frequent. The forest was eerily quiet as he hiked toward the summit of the peak known as the Devil's Backbone Trail. The morning sun was pale and provided very little warmth as Thatcher climbed higher into the thin and freezing air. He stopped every half mile to calibrate his receivers and check for any signs of early radio wave interference today. By 3 in the afternoon, the sky began to turn a bruised purple color as a massive storm moved in. Thatcher found a small clearing near an old rock outcropping and began to set up his primary monitoring station there. He hammered long copper rods into the frozen earth to serve as a ground for his high-frequency antenna array. The wind started to pick up speed, and the first few flakes of dry snow began to swirl around him. Thatcher pulled on his heavy gloves and watched the green line on his oscilloscope screen begin to dance and flicker. He knew that the specific atmospheric conditions required for the signal were finally starting to form in the upper atmosphere. The specialist crawled into his small alpine tent and prepared to spend the night listening to the sounds of mountain. He felt a strange sense of anticipation as he adjusted the volume on his primary receiver to listen for static. The white noise of the storm filled his headphones while the wind battered the thin fabric of his winter shelter. At exactly 9:19 in the evening, the static on the radio suddenly cleared and a voice began to speak. A man was repeating the numbers 919 over and over in a voice that sounded thin and very distant. Thatcher immediately checked his triangulation equipment and saw that the signal was coming from a ravine just below the ridge. He recorded the audio and noticed that the transmission was not coming from a digital source or a modern phone. The frequency was an old amplitude modulation band that had not been used for civilian communications since the 1950s. Thatcher grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the blinding white wall of the storm to find the signal source. He struggled to keep his footing on the icy rocks as he descended into the dark hollow where the transmission originated. The green light of his handheld tracker pointed him toward a collapsed structure hidden beneath a thick layer of snow. He cleared away the ice and found a heavy wooden door that led into a small underground stone storage cellar. The signal grew stronger as he approached the door, and the voice became clearer in his cold and tired ears. He pulled the handle with all his strength, and the door creaked open to reveal a dark and empty space. The cellar was built from heavy river stones and was filled with the smell of damp earth and old rotted wood. Thatcher shone his bright light around the room and saw a rusted radio transmitter sitting on a small wooden table. The device was clearly an antique from the middle of the last century, but it was glowing with a pale light. He reached out to touch the dial, but his hand passed right through the metal as if it were smoke. The specialist felt a sudden drop in the temperature and saw his breath forming thick clouds in the stagnant air. He noticed a leather logbook sitting on the floor and picked it up to examine the yellowed and brittle pages. The last entry was dated January 14, 1944, and it ended with the three digits 919. Thatcher realized that the date matched the current night, exactly, which sent a sharp chill down his tired, aching spine. He heard a sound behind him and turned to see a shadow standing in the corner of the small room. The shadow was shaped like a man wearing a heavy canvas coat and a hat from a different era altogether. The figure did not move or speak, but it pointed a gloved finger toward the back wall of the cellar. Thatcher moved closer to the wall and found a hidden compartment behind one of the large and heavy square stones. Inside the small space was a collection of handwritten letters and a photograph of a young woman named Clara Vance. The letters described a man named Elias who had been working as a secret radio operator during the Second War. He had been stationed in the mountains to monitor for enemy signals that might be crossing the Atlantic Ocean waves. One letter explained that Elias had been trapped in the cellar during a record blizzard and could not get out. He had used his radio to broadcast his coordinates, which were 9 degrees north and 19 degrees west of center. Thatcher realized that the signal was not a random set of numbers, but a desperate plea for a rescue. The specialist looked back at the corner of the room, but the shadow had vanished into the cold, dark air. He tucked the letters into his jacket and decided to head back to the safety of his mountain camp. The storm had reached a peak of intensity, and the wind was screaming through the trees like a wild animal. He struggled to climb back up the ridge while the radio in his pack continued to repeat the numbers. When Thatcher returned to the town the next morning, he went straight to the local historical society for some answers. He met with a woman who had lived in the valley her entire life and knew the mountain legends. He showed her the letters and the photograph of the woman named Clara from the old stone root cellar. The woman gasps and tells him that Elias Vance was her grandfather who had disappeared during the Great Winter Storm. She explained that the family had searched for him for years, but they never found a single trace of him. The authorities had eventually declared him dead, and the story of the missing radio operator became a local ghost legend. Thatcher realized that the signal he heard was a recording of the final moments of the life of Elias Vance. The specialist felt a heavy weight in his chest as he handed the letters over to the rightful family heirs. He told them about the cellar and the coordinates that had been repeating on the radio for 40 long years. The family was finally able to find the remains of Elias and give him a proper burial in the valley. The mysterious signal that had haunted the mountain for decades finally stopped appearing after the burial was completed that year. Thatcher Reed decided to leave the telecommunications business and move to a small farm on the edge of the forest. He often looks up at the ridges during the winter and wonders if other voices are still waiting for help. The specialist knows that the mountains have a memory that is longer and deeper than any modern technology can explain. He still keeps the logbook from the cellar on his shelf as a reminder of the night he met Time. The people in the valley no longer report the 919 signal when the January snow begins to fall. They say the mountain is finally quiet because the man who was lost has finally found his way back home. The ruins of the stone cellar are now overgrown with moss and have been reclaimed by the deep Appalachian woods. Hikers still pass by the site, but they never hear the crackle of the old radio waves in the wind. The story serves as a reminder that some secrets are meant to stay hidden until the right person arrives there. We are all just temporary travelers in a land that remembers everything that has ever happened in the cold dark. The silence of the winter woods is now peaceful, and the legend of the signal has faded into the mist. Investigators from the university eventually arrived to study the site, but they found no evidence of any radio equipment there. They claimed that the magnetic properties of the river stones might have created a natural recording of the old signals. Thatcher knew the truth was much more complicated than a simple scientific explanation could ever hope to fully describe. He had seen the shadow and felt the cold presence of a man who refused to be forgotten by history. The specialist never went back to the Devil's Backbone Trail during the month of January for the rest of his life. He preferred to stay by the fire and listen to the quiet crackle of the wood in his own stove. The letters and the photograph are now displayed in the local museum as a tribute to the Vance family history. Visitors read the story of the radio operator and look at the mountains with a new sense of quiet wonder. The numbers 919 are no longer a mystery, but a symbol of a promise that was finally kept. The winter wind still blows hard across the ridges, but it no longer carries the voice of a lost man. Some things are finally at rest, and the mountain has closed the door on that particular chapter of the past. The local dispatcher, who took the initial reports for 40 years, eventually visited the site to pay her final respects. She left a small bouquet of winter flowers near the collapsed stone chimney as a gesture of kindness and peace. The mountain seemed to accept the gift as the sun broke through the clouds for a brief moment that day. She felt a sense of closure that she had not experienced in all her years of working at the station. The reports of ghost signals have been replaced by simple stories of sightings of rare mountain lions and bears. The valley has returned to its quiet routine, and the mystery of the 919 signal is now a legend. Thatcher Reed remains the only person who knows exactly what it felt like to stand in that frozen room. He carries that memory with him like a secret map that leads to a place where time no longer exists. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand as silent sentinels over the lives of the people who live in shadows. Every winter, the snow falls and covers the earth in a thick blanket of white that hides the old scars. We are left to wonder what other signals are being broadcast from the deep corners of our own forgotten history. The radio is quiet now, but the mountain is always listening for the next call that needs an answer. In this new story, something answered when rescuers called the 919 number back. Emergency communication logs from the High Sierra regions often contain entries regarding signals that bypass modern digital encryption protocols. These events typically occur during the deepest winter months when the atmosphere is thick with ice crystals and electromagnetic static. 27-year-old telecommunications specialist Soren Vance worked as a systems analyst for the Regional Emergency Response Center. His job involved monitoring the relay towers that maintained a vital connection between isolated mountain outposts and the main station. In early February of 2022, he noticed a persistent alert flashing on his monitoring station during the graveyard shift. The notification system indicated a Priority 1 emergency broadcast originated from a sector that had no active towers or equipment. Soren checked the digital diagnostic panel several times, but the incoming signal remained steady and showed zero packet loss. The source location was identified as a remote ridge known as Ghost Pass, where no infrastructure had existed since the 80s. He put on his headset and adjusted the volume to hear the raw audio feed coming from the silent mountain sector. A faint, rhythmic, pulsing sound began to leak through the encrypted channel, usually reserved for federal law enforcement search teams. Soren used his specialized signal tracer to isolate the noise, but the frequency shifted every few seconds with perfect mathematical precision. It was a synthesized digital voice that repeated the numbers 919 over and over in a flat, hollow tone. He checked the active deployment map because there were no authorized teams working in that specific area on that night. The voice did not sound like any dispatcher or field agent he had ever encountered during his 3 years of service. He continued to monitor the transmission while the repeating signal began to feel like a physical pressure inside his head. Soren decided to record the audio and cross-reference it with the historical archives stored in the secure facility vault. He reached the digital storage vault and began searching for any mention of the 919 emergency resonance frequency. The data indicated that a similar signal had been recorded during a massive blizzard in 1974 near Ghost Pass. Records from that era described a technician named Silas Thorne who had disappeared while investigating a mysterious radio interference pattern. Silas had been sent to the pass to repair a damaged copper line that connected a remote fire lookout tower. The archived notes mentioned that the radio signal started as a faint whisper before it eventually became loud enough to scream. Soren looked at the last transcript, which simply stated that the technician was going to follow the signal to its source. He felt a sudden chill as he realized the signal he was hearing today was identical to the 1974 recording. He contacted the lead dispatcher to report the anomaly and the strange historical connection he had uncovered in the archives. The dispatcher responded with static at first, but then the 919 signal cut through the transmission with terrifying clarity. Soren was ordered to remain at his station while a field unit was sent to investigate the remote mountain ridge. He watched the real-time tracking data as the emergency vehicle moved toward the trailhead leading up to Ghost Pass. The headlights of the truck were visible on the remote camera feed until the thick fog swallowed the entire valley floor. He stepped away from his desk to grab a cup of coffee, but a loud sound stopped him in his tracks. The radio in the break room began to play the same pulsing tone that he had been monitoring for hours. He realized the signal was no longer coming from the mountain, but was now broadcasting from inside the secure facility. The synthesized voice began to change and started to say his name between the repetitions of the numbers 919. He followed the sound toward the server room and found that every cooling fan in the racks had stopped spinning. The temperature in the room had dropped to nearly freezing despite the heavy insulation and the lack of external air vents. He opened the main diagnostic terminal and saw a series of symbols scrolling across the screen in bright green text. The numbers 919 were etched into the digital interface so deeply that the pixels began to burn and smoke. Soren reached out to touch the screen, but a massive static discharge knocked him backward onto the cold concrete floor. He looked up and saw a figure standing in the shadows of the server racks wearing a vintage parka. The person was holding a handheld radio that was emitting a steady blue glow in the middle of the darkness. He recognized the man from the file photo of Silas Thorne, who had been missing for over 40 years now. The investigation into the facility-wide power failure began the following morning when the sunrise finally hit the mountain peaks. Search teams found the emergency vehicle abandoned at the trailhead with the engine still running and the doors wide open. They discovered a portable radio belonging to the field unit that was transmitting on the 9.19 MHz band. The device was found sitting on top of a stone marker that was not listed on any official trail map. There were no signs of a struggle and no footprints in the fresh snow to suggest where the officer had gone. A park supervisor named Miller found a series of handwritten notes stuffed into the glove box of the abandoned truck. The handwriting matched the notes left by Silas Thorne in 1974 with terrifying accuracy and level of detail. Soren Vance was found inside the server room in a state of deep shock and suffering from extreme hypothermia. He told investigators about the figure he saw in the shadows and the blue light that came from the ancient. Forensic experts examined the server logs and found that a signal had originated from deep inside the solid granite walls. This frequency was measured at exactly 9.19 MHz, which is a band not utilized by any transmitter. Park staff now maintain a constant watch on that specific frequency during the winter months to prevent further loss of. They tell newcomers that the mountain has a way of recording the past and playing it back during the storms. Most people think it is just a technical glitch caused by the high altitude and the intense winter static. Soren never returned to his job at the communication center and moved to a city far from the mountains. He still keeps a small battery-powered radio in his house, but he never turns it on during winter nights. The mystery of the signal remains a quiet warning for those who work the high and lonely mountain relay stations. Silence is usually the safest thing you can hear when you are monitoring the vast and empty winter wilderness alone. Following a signal into the dark is how many careers end before the sun has a chance to rise again. The mountains do not have a voice of their own, so they must borrow one from the people living there. Safety is found in the networks that are mapped and the signals that we can actually verify and understand clearly. Dispatchers say to ignore the 919 because the source is never something that wants to be truly found. Stay on the grid and keep your radio tuned to the channels that the living people still use today. Winter has a way of making the world feel small and the mysteries of the air feel dangerous. Every year, the snow covers the evidence of those who decided to follow the signal into the high mountain pass. If you hear that pulsing sound in your headset, you should turn it off and walk away from the mountains. Nothing good ever comes from a signal that asks you to leave the safety of the known and familiar world. The mountain is a beautiful place, but it does not care if you find your way back to safety. Listen to the wind and the trees, but do not listen to the numbers that repeat in the dark night. Silence is a gift when the temperature drops and the world becomes a place of shadows and cold white snow. Soren knows the truth of the warning because he felt the pull of the mountain on that final night. He survived because he chose to close his eyes and ignore the haunting sounds coming through his small headset speaker. Many others were not as lucky, and their names are now part of the long list of the missing hikers. Keep your gear ready and your mind sharp when the winter wind begins to howl through the ancient forest trees. The signal is still out there waiting for the next person to listen long enough to feel the cold bite. Don't follow the 919 because the destination is a place where the sun never quite seems to rise. Stay safe and stay grounded when the high peaks call out with voices that do not belong to humans. The forest is deep, and the secrets are older than the names we have given to the stone. And keep the light on and the radio quiet while the winter holds the world in its cold and heavy. This is why the dispatchers tell you to never follow a signal that you cannot find on a map. The final report on the incident at Ghost Pass was heavily redacted by the regional authorities before being filed away. They claimed that a natural gas pocket had caused the hallucinations and the strange behavior of the electronics involved there. Soren did not believe the official explanation because he still felt the cold in his bones whenever it snowed outside. He spent his time researching the history of the ridge and found dozens of similar cases dating back several centuries. Each disappearance was preceded by a report of a repeating signal or a rhythmic sound coming from the mountain peaks. The local tribes had names for the mountain that translated to the place where the voices are kept forever. He realized that the technology we use to communicate is just another tool for the mountain to use against. The 919 signal was a lure designed to capture the curiosity of those who listened to the air. He often wondered if Silas Thorne was still wandering the server rooms of the world looking for a digital connection. The blue light he saw that night was not a part of any electrical system he had ever studied before. It was a manifestation of the energy that the mountain had stored over thousands of years of human activity there. He began to write his own logbook to document the things the authorities tried to hide from the public. He warned that the digital age had only made it easier for the mountain to find its next human victim. The frequency of the human heart is reportedly close to the resonance of the granite found in the Sierra. This similarity allows the mountain to broadcast directly into the minds of the people who are sensitive to it. Soren kept his notes hidden in a secure box that he buried in his backyard near the desert floor. He hoped that someone would find them before they also heard the pulsing sound of the 919 call. The record shows that the signal appeared again in 2024 during a record-breaking ice storm in Nevada. This time, a group of 3 researchers disappeared while tracking the movement of a glacier near Ghost Pass ridgeline. Their last transmission was a series of numbers that matched the 919 frequency with perfect digital audio quality. The search teams found no trace of their equipment or their bodies, despite a massive effort lasting 3 full weeks. The Park Service has since placed a permanent ban on any electronic devices within 5 miles of the pass. They claim it is to protect the delicate ecosystem, but the rangers know the real reason for the strict order. They have seen the blue lights flickering on the ridge when the moon is full and the air is. They have heard the voices of their former colleagues calling out from the static of their handheld radios at night. Silence is the only defense against an enemy that uses your own voice and your own technology to find you. The mountain is patient, and it will wait for the next generation of technicians to forget the old winter stories. It will wait for the next winter when the air is still and the signals can travel without any interference. Soren Vance lived the rest of his life in the desert, where the ground was sand and the sun. He never looked at a mountain again without feeling the weight of the 919 in his very soul. He knew that some calls should never be answered, regardless of how clearly they are heard by the dispatchers. The truth is buried under the ice, and the static and the redacted files of the National Park Service. Stay away from the sector known as Ghost Pass and keep your radio tuned to the truth of nature. This is the story of the call that was not on any network but was heard by the living. Why locals refused to use this forest shortcut in January. The narrow dirt road cutting through the northern timberlands has remained officially closed during the winter months since 1984. Local records from the County Road Commission indicate that the route was abandoned after a series of unexplained mechanical failures. Silas Vance was a 48-year-old heavy equipment mechanic who lived in a small cabin near the forest edge. He was a practical man who understood the limits of a diesel engine and the dangers of the mountain snow. On a freezing afternoon in late January, Silas decided to use the restricted forest shortcut to reach a stranded client. He checked his emergency gear and grabbed a heavy wool blanket before starting his loud truck in the fading light. The first flakes of snow began to fall as he pulled off the main highway and onto the dirt path. He knew the shortcut would save him 2 hours of driving if the road remained clear of deep drifts today. Silas gripped the steering wheel as the wind picked up and started pushing the heavy truck toward the icy ditch. The visibility dropped to near zero within minutes as the world outside the windshield turned into a blinding wall of. He noticed that his radio was only producing a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the dashboard panel. This was confusing because he was well within range of the local station and his antenna was still intact, and Silas slowed the truck to a crawl and tried to find the familiar landmarks that guided him through the dents. He saw a faint, shimmering light coming from behind a thick stand of ancient pine trees just a few yards. When he pulled over to investigate, he found a small iron gate that he had never noticed in 20 years. The gate was covered in a layer of frost, but it felt strangely warm to his bare and calloused. He pushed the gate open and found a narrow path that led down into a small valley hidden from the profess. Silas felt a sense of curiosity and followed the trail while he held his lantern high to see the way. The air in the valley was thick with the scent of pine needles and something sweet like very ripe fruit. He reached the bottom and found himself in a circular clearing filled with dozens of antique glass jars on shelves. Each jar contained a swirling gray mist that seemed to pulse in time with the low humming sound heard earlier. Silas reached out to touch one jar and heard a muffled voice speaking his name from inside the thick. The voice sounded exactly like his father, who had been missing since the Great Blizzard of 1952 today. Silas backed away in terror, but the path behind him had suddenly vanished under a massive and heavy snowdrift. The storm lasted for 6 days and kept the town residents trapped inside their homes while the snow piled. When the roads were finally cleared, the local priest went to the woods to check on the missing heavy. He found the truck idling near the iron gate, but there was no sign of Silas in the main. The search party noticed the small gate, which was now standing wide open and glowing with a soft blue. They entered the hidden valley and found Silas sitting on the floor, staring at a single empty glass jar today. His hair had turned completely white, and he was unable to speak or recognize any of his old friends. The investigators noted that the temperature inside that small hidden clearing was exactly 72 degrees, despite the blizzard. They also found a tape recorder on the shelf that had been running for the entire 6-day period. The local authorities took the tape to the station to see if it captured any clues about the event. The recording began with the sound of Silas breathing heavily as he struggled with the frozen iron gate initially today. Then the humming sound grew louder until it drowned out the noise of the wind howling outside the forest shortcut. Dozens of different voices began to speak at once, and they all seemed to be reciting local town history secrets. They spoke of births and deaths and secrets that had been buried in the valley for over 100. The most disturbing part of the audio was the sound of a large crowd cheering in the quiet background. It sounded as if the small forest clearing was actually a massive stadium filled with thousands of invisible people. The recording ended with a single clear sentence spoken by a voice that matched the missing mechanic exactly today. The voice on the tape said that the shortcut was not a road, but a waiting room for later years. Silas Vance never spoke another word, and he spent the rest of his life in a quiet care facility. The county elders decided to seal the forest shortcut with several layers of thick industrial-strength concrete and iron. They then removed the road from all official maps to ensure no one would ever find the hidden valley. The parish records from that year were lost in a suspicious fire that broke out in the rectory office. Today, the forest stands empty, and the shortcut remains a restricted area that is monitored by a security firm. Local legends say that if you stand near the iron gate during a storm, you can hear humming. The mystery of the glass jars and the gray mist was never solved by any official government investigation today. A final report from a structural engineer in 1995 noted that the concrete had developed strange, glowing. He suggested that the material was reacting to a thermal source deep underground that should not exist in that. The forest was eventually decommissioned, and the land was sold to a private trust that keeps the property gated. Some believe the jars were not just holding words, but were acting as a seal for something much older. The voicemail Silas Thorne left for his sister on the night he disappeared is still kept in a secure. He sounded happy on the recording and told her that he was finally learning how to truly listen today. The shortcut remains a tomb of concrete and secrets that the town has agreed to leave alone in dark. It is a quiet reflection that some parts of history are better left buried deep beneath the winter snow. The archives of the local historical society contain a photograph taken just hours before Silas drove into the woods. In the background of the image, a tall figure can be seen standing near the entrance of the shortcut. The figure appears to be holding a device that matches the description of the silver jars found in clearing. There is no record of anyone being in that area on the day Silas vanished during the heavy snow. This evidence suggests that the shortcut has been watched by something that does not belong to the modern world. The town has since moved the highway to avoid the ridge where the mechanic disappeared so many years. People still avoid that area when the first signs of a heavy snowstorm begin to appear on the horizon. They know that the wind carries more than just snow and that some voices should never be followed today. The mystery of the red lights beneath the ice was never solved by any official diving team or underwater. They found no wreckage and no signs of any vehicle that had fallen from the ridge into the concrete span was eventually demolished in 2005 to make way for a newer and safer steel. Workers during the demolition reported hearing the sound of a phone ringing inside the hollow pillars of the. They also found a collection of personal items, including watches and rings, that dated back to the 1920s. These items were found embedded deep within the concrete as if they had been placed there when building. The most disturbing find was a set of human footprints that led into a solid wall, and then the story of the forest shortcut remains a part of the local lore that people share during winter. The voicemail that Silas Vance left for his sister was the last time anyone heard his natural voice today. He sounded calm and told her that he was finally going to see the city that everyone was talking. He mentioned that the bus was on time and that the driver was a very old friend of. The recording is a haunt that plays in the minds of the people who still live in the... It is a voice from the center of a storm that should have never been able to reach. We are left with the silence of the forest and the memory of a road that led nowhere. The journey into the white is a journey that we all must take when the signal is. The shadows are just waiting for the next deep freeze so they can show us the way back. The shortcut is gone, but the crossing is still there for those who know how to find. The regional forest supervisor ordered the area around the Iron Gate to be fenced off with heavy chain link. He claimed it was due to soil erosion, but the locals knew that the reason was much more. People who live near the base of the mountain say they still hear the humming sound on televisions. It happens most often during the first week of January when the air is still and the sun. They say it is the sound of Silas Vance still trying to radio for help from the other. The mountain keeps its silent vigil over the valley, and the pines whisper the names of those who... If you ever find a compass spinning in circles near a trail, you should turn around and walk. The warning from the logbook is still true, even if the man who wrote it is no longer. The shadows are always waiting for the right moment to step out and take what they feel. The final report from the county coroner was issued in 1985 and noted a strange lack. He stated that the lack of biological traces at the site suggested that Silas had simply ceased to. This conclusion was rejected by the state police, who believed that the mechanic had staged his own strange. They pointed to his clean bank records and his lack of personal debt as evidence that he stayed. However, his sister claimed that Silas was a man of high integrity who would never abandon his job. She kept the tape recorder from his truck in a safe place and listened to it every winter. She said that if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of a forest fire today. The mystery remains a part of the local lore that keeps the tourists away from the high ridge. A structural engineer who visited the site in 2010 found that the magnetic field was highly. He suggested that a massive energy discharge had occurred within the stone foundation during the peak of storm. Silas Vance was buried in the town cemetery, but his name is often whispered by those who fear. The story of the shortcut is a reminder that the woods hold secrets that we are not meant. We build our roads to cross the world, but sometimes the world is watching us from the deep. The silence of the forest is a heavy thing that stays with you long after you leave. Sometimes the truth is colder than the winter wind and harder to face than the freezing and salt. We are moving toward the end of the records, and the final page is a simple... It shows a door standing open to a forest filled with silver lights and people made of mountain. What Silas discovered after forcing the frozen gate was a man who had found his way back home. He was not a victim of the storm, but a host for a gathering that defied the winter. The mystery remains, but the facts are clear and the evidence is stored in the local police. We will remember the name of Silas Vance and the night the gray mist came inside to stay. The wind is picking up again and the snow is starting to fall on the high peaks. It is time to close the file and leave the mountain to its own devices today. The story is finished and the narrator is tired and the lights are starting to fade out. Good night to the valley and to the ridge and to the people who are still waiting there. The cold truth remains buried beneath the ice and the stone and the memory of the man who. We are just the listeners to an echo of a life that was taken by the wind today. The voicemail is the only proof that he was ever happy in the place where he finally. The warning was real and the cost was his life, but he seems to have found peace. We will keep the records safe and we will remember the name of the man who walked. The forest is waiting for the next winter to clear so it can show us something new. The story of Silas Vance is a part of the mountain now and forevermore in the day. This archived recording exposed a fatal mistake that changed the history of the entire Northern Valley for the truth is often colder than the winter wind and harder to face than the freezing today. The shortcut remains a quiet chapter in the history of the valley that no one wants to read. We build over the past, but the past has a way of reaching up and pulling us down. The mystery of the forest road is a silent witness to the power of the cold, and it remains a quiet chapter in the history of the valley that no one wants to read out. The new highway is monitored by several high-definition cameras, but the footage is often corrupted today. Technicians say the interference is caused by a magnetic source located deep within the earth below the woods. Some locals refuse to cross the area after the sun goes down, and they take the long. They know that the snow can hide things that we are not meant to see in light. The story of the road is a reminder that our structures are only as strong as the final report from the structural engineers noted that the concrete had a high concentration of unknown organic. They suggested that the shortcut was not just a road, but a living part of the mountain. This finding was ignored by the state board, who wanted to move forward with the new project today. They buried the old path in a deep pit and covered it with a layer of heavy. The site is now a quiet meadow where the grass grows tall and the birds sing today. But the humming remains, and the red lights still flicker deep beneath the surface of the black. If you find yourself on the road during a storm, you should keep your eyes on the fog. Do not look at the fog, and do not stop for any lights that you see. The shortcut is always there, even when it is gone from the world we see. The journey into the white is a journey that everyone must take when the time is finally. The shadows are just waiting for the light to fade so they can show you the way. The mechanic is still out there, and he is watching the trees to make sure no one. The story ends here in the quiet of the office where the files are stored today. We can only wonder what Silas saw in the clearing and why he chose to stay there. The mountain knows the answer, and the pines are not telling anyone what they have seen today. We are just listeners to the echo of a life that was taken by the snow. The voicemail is the only proof that he was ever happy in the place today. The warning was real, and the cost was his life, but he found his home. The cedar trees are the only ones that know the full story of what happened to the day. They stand tall against the wind and the snow while they watch the shadows move in the voicemail Silas left for his truck was never found by the team, but it exists today. He told the machine that he was finally seeing the colors of the wind, and the recording is a haunt that plays in the minds of those who have heard humming. We are left with the images and the whispers of a man who chose to. The search is over, but the discovery has only just begun for those who dare look. The mountain remains a giant in the clouds, and it keeps the names of the story ends where it began, in the quiet of the woods and the cold. Silas Vance was a man who understood the language of the forest and the secrets of the forest. He found the door that only opens once, and he decided to walk through to the side. The people of the valley still talk about the winter the earth spoke back in the dark. They tell the story to their children to make sure they stay away from the shortcut today. The memory of the mechanic is a warning that some roads should never be traveled in winter. The mountain keeps its secrets, and the snow covers the truth of what happened in the clearing. We are just the keepers of the records and the tellers of the story today. The journey is over, and the file is closed, and the forest is finally quiet. Good night to the mountain, and to the shortcut, and to the man who found his way in this new story. Footprints led off the Appalachian Trail toward a 919 marker. None came back. The rolling peaks of the southern Appalachian Range have watched over the land for hundreds of millions of long years. Most people who visit the trail find peace and beauty among the dense forests and the cold mountain stream water. However, some visitors discover that the wilderness holds a dark and heavy energy that refuses to let them go today. Silas Thorne was a 42-year-old search and rescue leader who had seen every inch of these woods. He spent his career tracking lost tourists and documenting the unusual geological shifts that occurred in the deep, dark valleys. Silas lived in a small wooden cabin near the edge of the national park where he kept his hiking gear. The ranger was a man of very few words who preferred the quiet company of trees over constant city noise. According to archived dispatch logs, the phone rang at the remote station during a cold morning in late October 2020. Reportedly, a young woman named Kaylee Vance told the dispatcher that her brother Beckett had failed to return from hiking. Beckett Vance was a 27-year-old photographer who was obsessed with capturing the unique light of the peaks. He had planned to hike a remote section of the trail that was known for its steep cliffs and caves. Kaylee told the rangers that her brother always stayed on the path and never took unnecessary risks with his life. The young man had sent a final text message from a location near a landmark known as the 919 marker. Silas gathered his supplies and prepared to lead a small team into the rugged terrain to find the missing man. The team reached the trailhead just as a light rain began to fall and turn the ground into thick mud. Silas noted that the atmospheric pressure was dropping rapidly, which often made the local animals act in a strange way. He checked his GPS and directed the searchers toward the high ridge where the 919 marker was supposedly located. This specific marker was a weathered stone pillar that had been placed there by a group of surveyors long ago. It sat at the intersection of 3 different trails that led into the deepest parts of the national forest land. When Silas arrived at the stone pillar, he noticed a set of footprints that were leading away from the path. The tracks were deep and clear, which suggested that Beckett had been carrying a very heavy load on his back. The rescue leader knelt in the dirt and examined the shape of the prints to determine the direction of movement. He realized that the footprints did not look like the standard tread of a modern hiking boot used by people. The impressions were smooth and narrow, as if the person were wearing thin leather shoes from a much older era. Silas felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he looked at the tracks leading toward the dark woods. He called out for Beckett, but the only response was the sound of the wind whistling through the bare trees. The other searchers found a piece of camera equipment lying near a pile of jagged rocks and yellow autumn leaves. It was a high-end lens cap that belonged to the expensive camera Beckett had carried on his long journey. They pushed through the thick laurel bushes and found a backpack sitting perfectly upright in a small and mossy clearing. The bag was completely dry, despite the rain that had been falling on the mountain for the last several hours. Silas opened the pack and found Beckett's professional camera tucked safely inside a padded and waterproof case for its protection. He turned on the device and began to scroll through the final images that had been captured by the photographer. The first few photos were beautiful shots of the sunrise over the distant peaks and the colorful fall foliage today. Then, the images began to change into blurred and distorted patterns of light that made no sense to the ranger. The final photo showed a tall and thin figure standing near a stone marker that looked like the 919. The ranger took a photograph of the image on the screen and compared it to the actual stone pillar nearby. He noticed that the marker in the photo had a series of strange symbols carved into the side of it. The actual pillar in front of him was smooth and bore only the numbers 919 inches faded red paint. He wondered if Beckett had found a different marker that was not recorded on any of the official park maps. The search leader decided to follow the strange footprints further into the woods, despite the growing darkness of the afternoon. He moved cautiously through the trees while the air became thick with a heavy scent of ozone and wet earth. The search team stayed close behind him as they navigated the steep and rocky slope of the hidden mountain valley. They came across another stone pillar that looked exactly like the first 919 marker after walking 2 miles. This marker was covered in the same mysterious symbols that Silas had seen in the photograph on the digital camera. The footprints circled the pillar several times before heading straight toward the entrance of a deep and dark limestone cave. Silas shone his powerful flashlight into the opening and saw that the walls were glowing with a soft blue light. The light seemed to pulse in a rhythmic pattern that matched the beating of a human heart in the quiet. He stepped inside the cave and felt a sudden wave of dizziness that made him lean against the cold stone. The air was warm and smelled like wildflowers, which was impossible during the cold and rainy month of late October. The cave tunnel narrowed as it descended into the earth, and the blue light became brighter with every single step. Silas found a notebook lying on the ground that contained Beckett's handwriting and several detailed sketches of the stone pillars. Beckett wrote that he had found a gateway that only opened when the atmospheric pressure reached a specific level. He claimed that the markers were not distance indicators, but were actually keys to unlocking a hidden part of nature. The photographer believed that the 919 represented a frequency that allowed a person to step out of time. Silas read the notes with a sense of growing dread as he realized that Beckett had planned this entire trip. The footprints ended at the edge of a deep pit that was filled with a swirling mist of silver color. There was no sign of Beckett's body in the pit, and the silver mist seemed to be swallowing all sound. Silas threw a small rock into the opening, but he never heard it hit the bottom of the dark hole. He noticed that the symbols on the cave walls were shifting and changing their shape as he watched them closely. The blue light intensified until it was almost blinding, and the ground began to vibrate with a low, heavy hum. Silas realized that the markers were acting as a homing beacon for something that lived deep within the mountain range. He ordered the search team to retreat from the cave immediately before the entrance could collapse on top of them. They scrambled back up the slope and made it out into the cold rain just as a tremor shook. The entrance to the cave was gone when Silas looked back, and only a solid wall of stone remained there. He searched the area for the markers, but the stone pillars had vanished along with the strange and narrow footprints. The only evidence that Beckett had ever been there was the camera and the notebook that Silas held in hands. The ranger returned to the station and filed a report that was quickly classified by the higher authorities of government. He was told to never speak of the 919 markers or the blue light in the hidden cave. The disappearance of Beckett Vance was officially recorded as a hiking accident caused by the rough and dangerous terrain today. Kaylee Vance never stopped looking for her brother, and she often visited the trail to leave flowers at the ridge. Silas Thorne could not let the mystery go, and he began to research the history of the 919. He found old journals from the 1800s that mentioned a group of people who had walked into the mountain. The journals spoke of a silent valley where the trees never died and the water flowed upward against the gravity. Every 100 years, a set of markers would appear on the trail to guide the chosen ones to the gate. Silas realized that Beckett had not been lost, but had been invited to a place that existed outside of world. The ranger often thought about the thin figure in the photograph and wondered if it was waiting for him too. He kept the notebook hidden in his desk and studied the symbols every night by the light of a candle. The Appalachian Trail remains a place of beauty, but it also carries a warning for those who look too closely. We are reminded that the Earth is much older and more mysterious than our modern maps and technology can show. The 919 is a number that lingers in the minds of the few people who know the truth. Footprints will always lead into the dark, but they do not always lead the way back to the light today. Silas Thorne retired from the Park Service and moved to a quiet town where the mountains were far away now. He never hiked the trail again, but he always listened to the wind for the sound of a camera shutter. The mountains keep their secrets well, and they will continue to watch over the land for millions of more years. In this new story, a distress call marked 919 led rescuers off the trail, then the radio cut out. The emergency dispatch center in a quiet mountain county received a call that defied every law of modern physics today. It was a cold Tuesday evening in January when the first heavy blizzard of the season slammed into the ridges. Dispatch logs recorded a man claiming he was trapped inside a stone cellar while the freezing wind howled outside then. The caller identified himself as a surveyor named Everett Vance, who was working near the boundary of the national forest. He sounded calm at first, but his voice became increasingly frantic as he described the rising snow against the door. The operator noted that the signal was strangely clear despite the remote location where cell towers were completely non-existent. For exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds, the man pleaded for someone to help him before the line cut out. 36-year-old land surveyor Everett Vance set out that morning to mark property lines for a local estate. He was a seasoned outdoorsman who grew up navigating the dense thickets and steep ridges of the southern Appalachian Range. Everett told his wife he would be back by 5 because a massive cold front was moving in quickly now. He carried a heavy pack with thermal gear and a satellite phone since communication was difficult in the deep hollows. The morning air was crisp and clear when he parked his truck at the end of a winding road. He spent several hours hammering iron stakes into the frozen earth while the sun hung low and pale today. The surveyor was focused on his task because the property lines had been disputed for more than 50 long years. He checked his topographic maps and carefully recorded the elevation changes as he moved through the thick groves of pine. By noon, the clouds moved in quickly, and the first few flakes of snow began to dance through the trees. Everett realized the storm was arriving much earlier than the local weather reports had predicted on the radio that morning. He packed his expensive tools into his heavy bag and started the 3-mile trek back toward his parked truck. The wind picked up speed, and soon the forest was transformed into a blinding white wall of swirling winter ice. He struggled to find the orange ribbons he had tied to the low branches because the visibility dropped to zero. Everett felt a sharp pinch of panic when he realized he had stepped off the main trail into an unknown ravine. He checked his handheld GPS, but the device flickered and died after the extreme cold drained the battery in minutes. The surveyor decided to find shelter under a rock overhang to wait out the worst of the conditions that afternoon. He stumbled upon a collapsed stone chimney that once belonged to a pioneer homestead hidden deep within the protected forest. A small wooden door led down into a root cellar that seemed remarkably intact despite the weight of the snow. Everett squeezed inside the cramped space and pulled the heavy door shut to block out the biting wind and air. He tried to use his satellite phone to call for help, but the signal was blocked by the thick walls. The man felt around in the dark and found a small shelf where a few rusted metal cans still sat. He waited for several hours while the storm roared outside and the temperature inside the cellar began to drop rapidly. Everett decided he had to make a move before the snow drifted over the entrance and trapped him underground forever. He pushed against the heavy wooden door, but it would not budge because several inches of ice had sealed it. The fear of being buried alive began to take hold as he realized his situation was becoming quite desperate today. He pulled out his emergency radio and managed to catch a faint signal from a repeater tower on the ridge. He dialed the emergency number and whispered his location into the receiver while his breath came out in thick clouds. Dispatchers heard him describe the stone cellar and the smell of damp earth as he begged for someone to help. He told them he could hear someone walking on the floorboards above him even though the house was a ruin. The operator asked him to stay calm and promised that a rescue team would be sent to his exact coordinates. Everett mentioned that he could see a faint light flickering through the cracks in the old floorboards above his head. The call ended with a loud burst of static that sounded like a heavy iron door slamming shut in distance. Search and rescue teams gathered at the trailhead the following morning after the storm finally broke and the sun appeared. They found the truck belonging to Everett covered in 2 feet of fresh snow, but there were no tracks nearby. A team of 12 volunteers spread out across the ridge and searched for any sign of the missing land surveyor. They tracked the signal from his last emergency call to a specific coordinate deep in a remote and wooded drainage. The rescuers reached the spot and found the ruins of an old homestead just as Everett had described yesterday. They saw the stone chimney standing tall among the trees and located the wooden door to the underground root cellar. 4 men worked together to shovel away the thick crust of ice that had formed over the heavy oak planks. They pried the door open and shone their flashlights into the dark hole to look for any sign of him. The cellar was completely empty except for a few rusted cans and a layer of dust that was not disturbed. There were no footprints in the dirt floor and no signs that anyone had been inside the room for decades. The searchers were confused because the 919 call had been traced directly to this exact set of geographic coordinates. They checked the surrounding area for any other structures, but the homestead was the only building for several miles around. The dust on the shelves was thick and gray, and the metal cans were rusted through from years of moisture. One of the rescuers noticed a strange smell in the air that resembled burnt wood and old pipe tobacco smoke. They searched the forest for another 5 hours, but found no sign of the man or his heavy surveyor pack. The mystery deepened when the dispatch logs were reviewed and the technicians noticed a strange anomaly in the audio file. A local historian named Silas Thorne joined the investigation after hearing about the strange disappearance on the evening news report. He spent hours digging through the county archives and found a collection of old photographs from the year 1924. One image showed a young man named Elias Vance standing in front of the very same stone cellar they searched. Elias was a distant relative of Everett who had vanished in a blizzard exactly 100 years before this search. Family records indicated that Elias had been working as a timber cruiser when a sudden winter storm trapped him alone. The historical documents noted that Elias was never found despite an extensive search by the local community during that winter. Silas showed the rescue team a journal entry from a witness who claimed to hear shouting coming from the earth. The witness reported hearing a man calling for his wife from inside the root cellar long after the snow melted. Investigators compared the recording of the emergency call to the descriptions of Elias found in the old handwritten family letters. The voice on the tape sounded remarkably like the descriptions of a man who had been lost for a century. Forensic technicians analyzed the signal and discovered that the call did not actually originate from a modern satellite phone device. The frequency matched a type of radio equipment that had not been in regular use since the middle of 1940. Silas pointed out that Elias had a wife named Clara who had waited for him until the day she died. The 919 call recording featured a moment where the caller whispered the name Clara before the line went dead. This detail was never released to the public, but it sent a wave of fear through the entire local community. The coordinates of the call matched the exact spot where Elias was believed to have taken shelter during the storm. The audio experts discovered that the background noise in the call contained sounds of a working farm from the past. They could hear the distant lowing of cattle and the ringing of a blacksmith hammer on a heavy steel anvil. These sounds were impossible because the area had been a protected national forest with no farms for over 80 years. The signal itself seemed to be bouncing off an invisible layer in the atmosphere that only exists during solar flares. A solar flare had indeed occurred on the night Everett went missing, which added another layer to the mystery today. Technicians from the state university were called in to study the strange magnetic readings near the old stone chimney. They found that the magnetic field in the cellar was spinning in a way that defied the laws of nature. It was as if the room itself was a pocket of time that had become stuck in the past. The search for Everett Vance continued for another week until the spring thaw began to pull the snow away today. A group of hikers found his body resting quietly at the base of a tall cliff 5 miles away then. He was wrapped in his thermal gear, and his pack was still strapped tightly to his tired and frozen shoulders. His satellite phone was tucked away in a side pocket, and the battery was still showing a full charge today. Investigators checked the call logs on the phone, but there was no record of any call made to the center. The 919 call that the dispatchers answered had come from a source that could not be traced to him. His internal GPS showed that he had never even reached the homestead ruins during his long trek through the storm. He had fallen from the cliff hours before the call was ever received by the dispatch center in town. The state police held a press conference, but they had no answers for the grieving family of the lost surveyor. They could not explain how a call was made from a location he never visited while he was clearly dead. The mystery of the 3-digit code 919 remained a topic of intense debate among the local residents. Some experts suggested it was a forgotten emergency code used by early timber companies during the Great Depression era today. Others believed it was a sequence of numbers that held a personal meaning to the Vance family for many generations. The cedar chest in the attic of the family home contained more clues that only deepened the strange mystery. Inside the chest was a map drawn by Elias Vance that showed the exact location of the stone root cellar. The map was marked with the numbers 919 in heavy black ink near the corner of the page. It appeared that both men were drawn to the same spot in the woods by a force they misunderstood today. The coordinates of the 919 call led the rescuers to a place where a man had died a century ago. Some people believe that the mountain has a way of folding time when the wind blows through the pines then. Everett had never made it to the cellar, but his ancestor may have finally found a way to reach out. The stone walls of the old homestead remain silent today as the forest slowly grows back over the history now. An iron key was later found in the pocket of Everett, which fit the lock of the old cellar. No one knows how he got the key or why he was carrying it on the day he disappeared. The mountain continues to guard its secrets while the snow falls softly over the ridges of the deep woods. It serves as a reminder that some messages take 100 years to reach the people who are finally listening. The local dispatcher who took the call was named Joyce Miller, and she had worked at the station for years. She told investigators that the voice on the other end of the line was filled with a strange ancient static. The man had asked for a woman named Clara, which was the name of the wife of Elias Vance then. Joyce felt a chill go down her spine as she listened to the recording of the call in the office. She noticed that the background noise included the sound of a wood stove crackling, even though the cellar had nothing. The logs showed the call was placed at the exact minute the storm reached its peak intensity over the ridge. Searchers returned to the stone cellar one last time to look for any hidden compartments or tunnels beneath the floor. They found nothing but the cold, damp earth and the heavy smell of mineral deposits that had formed over years. One volunteer found a small iron key buried under a pile of rotted leaves near the entrance of the cellar. The key matched a lock on an old cedar chest that had been passed down through the Vance family tree. Inside the chest was a letter written by Clara Vance expressing her hope that her husband would one day return. The letter was dated exactly 1 week after the blizzard of 1924 had devastated the small mountain town. Locals still talk about the night the radio waves crossed through time and brought a message from the deep snow. Some say the energy of the storm was enough to open a window between the past and the present day. Others believe that the bond of the family was so strong it could reach across a century of winter ice. The state police officially closed the case and cited accidental exposure as the cause of the tragic death of Everett. They could not explain how the emergency call was placed or why the coordinates led directly to the old ruins. The audio files of the 919 call were eventually moved to a secure archive where they remain locked away now. A few technicians who heard the full recording claim that a second voice can be heard whispering in the end. The second voice sounds like a woman welcoming a traveler home after a very long and cold journey through woods. The stone chimney still stands as a lonely monument to the secrets that the Appalachian Mountains keep hidden from world. Hikers are warned to stay on the marked trails and to keep their radios off during the heavy winter storms. The mountain does not always give back what it takes, and sometimes the past finds a way to call help. We are left to wonder how many other voices are waiting in the silence of the high mountain ridges today. The story of Everett Vance and his ancestor Elias remains a haunting reminder of the things we cannot ever explain. The radio waves have faded into the wind, but the stone cellar still waits for the next heavy winter snow. The cold truth behind this coastal lookout in winter: the concrete observation tower on the jagged northern cliffs was built in 1942 to guard the freezing shoreline. Local archives from the winter of 1976 describe a season where the sea ice pushed unusually far south. Silas Thorne was a 54-year-old retired lighthouse keeper who lived in a small cottage near the bluff. He was a practical man who understood the shifting tides and the way the salt spray could freeze on metal. On a gray afternoon in late December, Silas noticed the barometer dropping while a thick mist rolled off the water. He planned to walk to the tower to check the structural integrity of the old iron railing for the county. He checked his heavy coat and grabbed a lantern before heading toward the path that led along the steep cliffs. The first flakes of snow began to fall as he reached the heavy steel door at the base of the brain. Silas forced the rusted door open and felt a strange wave of warm air rising from the dark stone stairs. This was confusing because the tower had been abandoned for years and there were no heaters inside the cold structure. He climbed the spiral staircase and noticed that the walls were covered in a thin layer of pulsing green moss. The air smelled like ozone and wet copper, and he heard a low humming sound that made his teeth ache. He reached the observation deck and saw that the glass windows were completely frosted over with thick and white ice. Silas moved to the center of the room and found a small wooden chair sitting perfectly in the middle floor. A heavy brass telescope was mounted on a tripod, and it was pointed directly at a spot on the horizon. He looked through the lens and saw a massive dark shape moving slowly through the ice and the freezing. The shape did not resemble any ship or submarine that Silas had ever seen during his long years at sea. It looked like a floating island made of black stone that was surrounded by a ring of flickering red lights. Silas reached for his radio to alert the Coast Guard, but the device only produced a loud and steady static. The humming sound grew louder until the entire tower began to vibrate and the green moss started to glow brighter. He felt a sudden pressure in his chest, and his vision blurred as the red lights on the horizon expanded. Silas looked back at the telescope and saw that the dark shape was now much closer to the shoreline cliffs. He realized that the humming was coming from the stone beneath his feet and not from the winter wind outside. The door to the observation deck slammed shut, and he found himself locked inside the small and freezing room. The blizzard lasted for 5 days and buried the coastline under 4 feet of heavy and salt-crusted white snow. Search teams finally reached the tower on the morning of January 2nd to look for the missing retired lighthouse keeper. They found the steel door at the base was welded shut from the inside with a material that resisted saws. When they eventually breached the room, they found Silas Thorne sitting in the wooden chair with his eyes closed tight. The room was incredibly hot, and the air was filled with the smell of scorched earth and old seawater. Investigators noted that Silas was holding a small notebook that contained a single sentence written over and over again. The message stated that the Watchers were back and that the cold was only a mask for the fire. They found his lantern on the floor, but the fuel had been replaced with a thick and glowing silver. The local authorities took the notebook to the station to see if it held any clues about the event there. The handwriting matched Silas exactly, but the language used was a dialect that had not been spoken for centuries nearby. A recording device found in his pocket captured the sound of the wind and a deep and rhythmic metal. The audio revealed a voice that sounded like Silas, but the tone was mechanical and lacked any human emotional quality. The voice claimed that the tower was a beacon for the travelers who were waiting beneath the dark winter. It mentioned that the stone was waking up and that the sea ice was a shield for the emerging heat. The search team found no footprints around the tower except for the single set leading to the heavy steel. The local coroner ruled the cause of death as cardiac arrest, but he could not explain the internal. The coastal lookout was eventually demolished in 1981 after several other residents reported seeing red lights in the. No one could ever explain how the tower had become so hot during the coldest week of the recorded century. Technicians verified that the earth beneath the foundation had been melted and then refrozen into a glass-like black. Some locals believe the tower was built on top of an ancient site that was older than the church. Others think Silas had found a way to communicate with something that lived deep beneath the cold and dark. The mystery of the glowing moss and the silver fuel was never solved by any state or federal agency. It remains a story told by those who remember the winter. The cliffs began to hum in the dark. The observation tower is gone, but the feeling of being watched still remains for those who walk. A retired deputy discovered a series of photographs in the attic of the old courthouse 3 years ago during renovations. One image showed Silas Thorne standing on the deck of the tower a few hours before the storm hit hard. In the background of the photo, a massive shadow can be seen rising from the water near the coastal. The shadow had several glowing ports that matched the location of the red lights described in the old reports. There was no ship registered in the area that matched the size or the strange shape of the dark. This evidence suggests that Silas was not alone when he entered the tower to check the old iron railing. The town has since placed a warning sign near the path to discourage hikers from approaching the cliff edge. People still report hearing a low hum during the winter months when the sea ice begins to form. The ground where the tower once stood remains barren, and no plants will grow there despite the rich coastal soil. Structural engineers who visited the site in 2010 found that the magnetic field was still highly unstable. They suggested that a massive energy discharge had occurred within the stone foundation during the peak of the storm event. Silas Thorne was buried in the town cemetery, but his name is often whispered by those who fear the dawn. The story of the lookout is a reminder that the ocean holds secrets that we are not meant to. We build our towers to watch the world, but sometimes the world is watching us from the deep dark. The silence of the cliffs is a heavy thing that stays with you long after you leave the... Sometimes the truth is colder than the winter wind and harder to face than the freezing and salt. The voicemail Silas left for his sister was the last time anyone heard his natural voice before the search ended. He sounded confused and told her that the horizon was burning with a light that had no heat at. He mentioned that the telescope was showing him a city that was built out of ice and black stone. The recording is a haunt that plays in the minds of the people who still live in the... It is a voice from the center of a blizzard that should have been silenced by the cold wind. We are left with the empty cliffs and the memory of a man who saw too much there. The journey into the white is a journey that everyone must take when the signal is finally right. The shadows are just waiting for the next deep freeze so they can show us the way. The truth is buried deep, and the mountain is silent, and the sea keeps its own dark secret. Today, the lookout is just a memory and a few scattered pieces of concrete on the jagged and sharp. No one goes up there during the winter months, and the birds have stopped nesting in the nearby trees. The mountain sits in the mist and waits for the next person to ignore the warnings of the wind. The cycle of the snow and the wind and the lights continues as it has for many years. The memory of Silas Thorne is a ghost in the records and a whisper in the cold salt. Sometimes the things we find on the cliffs are just the things we left behind a long time. The journey into the white is a path that leads to a place where time has no pass. The shadows are waiting for the light to fade so they can show you the truth of the lookout is gone, but the watchers are still there in the deep and freezing and silent.